Think your government's honest? No. Look, across history, states have lied, covered up, and flat out rewritten reality to hide the atrocities they commit. That's why we don't trust them, isn't it?
No.
From engineered famines to medical torture to secret police and propaganda campaigns, polished to perfection, these are not conspiracies, they are documented, proven history. And we've got 50 entries lined up for you today. 50 times a powerful got away, sometimes literally with murder, and just kind of hope that you wouldn't notice. But we did. And let's start in familiar territory, the UK, home to some of the most brazen state-sponsored brutality you've probably never been taught. Number 1. Bloody Sunday. The 30th of January 1972 was supposed to be just another ordinary Sunday in Derry, Northern Ireland, but by sunset, it had earned the tragic nickname of Bloody Sunday. What began as a civil rights march against unjust internment laws turned into an abject bloodbath when British soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment opened fire onto a crowd of unarmed demonstrators. 13 were killed on the spot. A 14th victim later succumbed to their wounds. Even before the bodies were buried, however, the official spin machine spun up into action, with both the British Army and government that paid its wages swiftly insisting that the soldiers had only fired in self-defense at armed terrorists among the protesters. This was during the Troubles, after all, a decades-long conflict in Northern Ireland between mainly Protestant Unionists who wanted to remain in the UK and the mainly Catholic nationalists who sought unification with Ireland. So such an explanation was nothing if not within the realm of possibility to the casual observer. The narrative, painting the victims as gunmen and bomb throwers, was fed to the press before nightfall. And to really cement it in the public consciousness, the authorities also convened a rushed inquiry led by Lord Chief Justice John Widgery. Within 11 weeks, his tribunal had effectively exonerated the soldiers and suggested that the dead marchers were partly to blame, with his report implying that some victims had been handling weapons or bombs. In other words, that the army might have been shooting at legitimate threats, or at least would have had cause to believe so. In Derry, this so-called inquiry, well, it was met with fury. Locals derided it as the Widgery whitewash, with the late former Bishop of Derry, Edward Daly, who had attended to the dying as bullets whizzed around him, calling the report the second atrocity. For decades, the families of those killed fought to clear their loved ones' names. It was a fight that took 38 years, as it was only in 2010 that a new inquiry led by Lord Savile saw the cover-up comprehensively debunked, confirming what the people of Derry had known from day one, that all those killed were unarmed and posed no threat. The Prime Minister publicly apologized, calling the killings
unjustified and unjustifiable.
But it was an apology that rang hollow for many. The damage had been done, their loved ones weren't coming back, and the perpetrators were all pushing pension age. So it was doubtful any of them would ever face justice, especially when one considers that as time of writing, only one of the paras, the so-called Soldier F, has been prosecuted, specifically for the murders of James Ray and William McKinney, as well as a further 5 counts of attempted murder. He, for his part, pleaded not guilty in December 2024, and his trial is set to begin in September this year. That's 2025. Number 2, the Peterloo massacre. Bloody Sunday was not the first such massacre to occur in the UK, however, far from it in fact. Another notable example actually occurred all the way back on the 16th of August, 1819. On that fateful day, a crowd of some 60,000 men, women and children had gathered peacefully at St. Peter's Field in Manchester to demand political reform and representation. Many even treated it as a family outing for liberty, coming in their Sunday best. What they got was a bloodbath. Local magistrates panicked at the sight of the huge assembly, you see, and terrified things were about to get just a bit French Revolution-y. They decided that the cavalry were to be sent in. Literally. And so it was that the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry, as well as the Cheshire Yeomanry, charged the unarmed crowd with sabres drawn, slashing and trampling as they went. By the time the chaos subsided, at least 18 people lay dead, including at least one woman and a child, and as many as 700 were injured. some maimed for life. So abject was the horror, and so unrelenting were the yeomanry in carrying out their orders, that the term the Peterloo massacre quickly started to circulate, a bitter nickname that drew comparison to the tactics utilized against the protesters and those that had been utilized against Napoleon's forces not even a decade prior. And as if the massacre itself was not horrific enough, the official response only compounded it further, as rather than admitting wrongdoing, the British authorities doubled down, with the Home Secretary down in London congratulating the magistrates on quelling a riot that very same day. From there, in the weeks that followed, the government also moved aggressively to snuff out any sympathetic coverage of the incident, passing a package of repressive laws, the infamous 6 Acts. The first 4 of these were aimed at nipping future such gatherings in the bud, but the final 2, the Blasphemous and Seditious Libel Acts and the Newspaper and Stamp Duties Acts, were directly aimed at controlling the spread of information regarding Peterloo, with the former increasing penalties up to 14 years transportation for publishers of materials deemed blasphemous or seditious, and the latter extended stamp duties to cover cheaper publications and pamphlets. This dramatically increased their cost, putting them out of reach of the working classes. And yet, despite such efforts, news of the Peterloo massacre did spread thanks to outraged observers and rebel journalists. The truth that peaceful protesters were cut down by sword-wielding cavalry became a rallying point for reformers. One witness, a young textile merchant named John Edward Taylor, was actually so appalled that he later founded the Manchester Guardian, today just the Guardian newspaper, to at least try to hold the powerful to account. Still, the full story was ultimately suppressed. There were no official apologies or admissions of guilt, and the only arrests were of Henry Hunt, the rally's organizer, who received 2 years in prison, and several of his colleagues who received similar sentences. Number 3. The Windscale fire. When thinking of nuclear disaster cover-ups, chances are you're probably going to think of the Soviet Union. That's, of course, thanks to the now infamous events that occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant back in '86. But, in fact, the Soviets were far, far from the only people to do this, with the UK also having done a little bit of covering up. This occurred in October 1957 at Windscale in Cumbria, now known as Sellafield, and it saw a nuclear reactor dedicated to producing plutonium for Britain's atomic bombs catch fire deep inside of its graphite core, thanks to an energy release that went out of control during routine maintenance. Sounds familiar. For 3 days, Britain's first nuclear accident would rage out of control. Technicians and firefighters alike risked their lives to contain the blaze, which sent radioactive particles billowing across the skies of northwest England and beyond. And while it was eventually brought under control before the situation could become a total calamity, it still claimed as many as 240 lives when long-term cancer deaths are accounted for, and it was the worst nuclear disaster in British history ever. And yet at the time, almost no one even knew that it had happened. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan's administration feared that news of a nuclear fire would shatter public confidence and jeopardize sensitive atomic cooperation with the US. So rather than coming clean, officials downplayed everything. As a result, no evacuation orders were issued for nearby villages despite the radioactive plume, and farmers were given only vague excuses for why their milk was being taken and dumped. The press was given minimal information, just a brief announcement that a minor incident at an atomic plant had been brought under control. Any minor incident at an atomic plant? Look into that further, everybody. And behind closed doors, Macmillan demanded the official report on the fire be heavily censored. Even the brave workers who had saved the day received little public recognition, their heroism remaining largely secret. But the truth did come out eventually, even if it was only because the documentation pertaining to it had somehow found its way to the to-be-declassified pile in 1988. Then, and only then, did the British public finally get to learn just how close they'd come to their own Chernobyl-esque catastrophe. Number 4. The Hillsborough disaster cover-up. On the 15th of April 1989, a football match in Sheffield's Hillsborough Stadium turned into one of the darkest tragedies in modern British history, and its aftermath into one of the most notorious cover-ups. The events themselves were tragically straightforward. Liverpool and Nottingham Forest supporters alike had both made the trip to the Steel City to see their respective teams square off in an FA Cup semi-final, and too many people were let into the central pens of one of the stands, somewhere in the region of 3,000 or so, as compared to an official capacity of 2,200 and a revised post-disaster figure of 1,693. This overcrowding soon led to a horrific human crush, and fans pressed against steel fencing began to asphyxiate, trapped by the unyielding metal as more people still continued to push in behind them. When all was said and done, that day, 96 men, women, and children would lose their lives. It was a disaster born of negligence and simply nothing else. But what followed was an organized campaign to shift the blame from the authorities, who people were rightly furious with for allowing such a situation to occur at all, onto the victims. In fact, even as bodies lay on the pitch, senior South Yorkshire police officers were spinning a false narrative. To conceal their own fatal crowd control errors, they briefed the media that drunken, ticketless Liverpool fans had stormed an exit gate, causing the crush. But get this, it was actually them, South Yorkshire police officers, who had flung that gate wide open without proper crowd management, directly leading to the overcrowding. Nonetheless, the press lapped up the official line, and within hours, headlines like, well, this were being sent to the printers. Every one of those lurid accusations, every single one of them was a lie, but the damage was done. And so an appalling tragedy was now largely believed to be a hooligan riot. And it gets worse, because the cover-up also continued in more subtle ways. Police officers' statements were vetted and systematically altered to remove any criticisms of the police response. Crucial evidence, like logs of delayed emergency reactions, were buried. And at the initial coroner's inquest, held in 1990, the authorities clung to their fabricated story, and the proceedings returned a verdict of accidental death, ruling out blame for the officials in charge. No one in authority was held accountable at the time at all. And so the bereaved families had to not only endure their grief, but also fight against the cruel stigma that their loved ones had somehow contributed to their own deaths. It took 23 years of relentless campaigning by the victims' families and survivors to expose the full truth. In 2012, an independent panel review of thousands of documents obliterated the cover-up, confirming that police failures and subsequent deceit were to blame, and not the fans. The British Prime Minister issued a formal apology for the double injustice of Hillsborough, the tragedy itself, and the decades-long whitewash that followed. Did the people accept this apology? Well, put it this way, good luck finding a copy of The Sun for sale in Liverpool or Sheffield to this very day. Number 5. The Chagos Islands expulsion. And for our final British entry, imagine being born on a tranquil tropical island, only to be told one day that you must leave forever because a superpower has decided that your home is the perfect site for a military base. That's exactly what happened in the late 1960s to the entire population of the Chagos Archipelago, a remote British colony in the Indian Ocean, as over the course of several years, the UK, in a secret deal with the United States, forcibly uprooted about 2,000 islanders from their ancestral homes. These people, whose communities had lived on the coral atolls for generations, farming and fishing in their lagoons, were herded onto overcrowded ships and dumped in faraway slums in Mauritius and the Seychelles, their homes demolished, and their beloved pets rounded up and euthanized. By 1973, the last bewildered families were gone, and their idyllic world was handed over to the US to be converted into an airbase. The manner of this expulsion remains a blight on Britain's record. To avoid international scrutiny and political fallout, as colonialism wasn't exactly what you'd call trendy in the 1960s, British officials concocted a cruel legal fiction. They declared that the Chagos Islands had no permanent population, given that Chagosians can trace their habitation of the islands back to 1793, when France first brought slaves from what is now Mozambique and Madagascar to found a coconut plantation. That claim is an outright and brazen lie. But it was a lie that allowed London to carve off the Chagos Archipelago from colonial Mauritius in 1965, creating a new entity, the British Indian Ocean Territory, with the intent of depopulating it. In internal memos, UK bureaucrats discussed the islanders' fate in chillingly callous terms, with one extract from the declassified documentation stating, and we'll quote here, "Unfortunately, along with the birds go some few Tarzans or Men Fridays whose origins are obscure and who are hopefully being wished on to Mauritius, etc." And another quote here, "The object of the exercise is to get some rocks which will remain ours. There will be no indigenous population except seagulls who have not yet got a committee." There were no newspaper announcements about the plight of the deported islanders. On the contrary, British authorities instructed diplomats and journalists to downplay or lie about what was happening, referring to the Chagosians as merely transient contract workers rather than an indigenous people. For decades, the Chagosian story remained largely hidden from the world. The exiled families languished in poverties on the margins of Mauritian and Seychelles society, dreaming of their lost paradise while others built runways and radar stations where they'd once grown crops and built families. Only in the 2000s did declassified documents, investigative journalists, and legal challengers bring the truth to light. These revelations showed how meticulously Britain had planned and executed the erasure of a people, from secretly buying out the coconut plantation business that employed many islanders to drafting an immigration ordinance that made it illegal for Chagosians to ever return home. You may think that there was a ray of hope in this story because in May 2025, the UK agreed to sign the archipelago over to Mauritius. But you'd be wrong, as the US is still going to be leasing that airbase, just off for someone different, so the odds are the Chagosians, they're never going home. Number 6. Operation Northwoods. Okay, so we've spent the last few chapters taking a hard look at Britain, from colonial expulsions to stadium cover-ups and nuclear fires. It was a big run, but now it's time to cross the Atlantic and look at the United States, because in 1962, right at the heart of Cold War paranoia, the highest-ranking generals in America signed off on a plan so unhinged and so outlandish that even Tom Clancy would write it off as just being a bit too unbelievable. It was called Operation Northwoods, and it very nearly happened. The basic idea? To justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba, the US military proposed staging a series of false flag attacks that would deliberately kill or terrorize American civilians and military personnel, and then pin the blame on Fidel Castro. The plan laid out a chillingly creative buffet of options, with one proposal wanting to fake a Cuban attack on a US Navy ship, a la the USS Maine incident that had kicked off the Spanish-American War. Another proposed orchestrating a, quote, communist Cuban terror campaign in American cities like Miami and Washington, D.C., with bombs planted in busy streets, fires set in public buildings, and fabricated evidence pointing to Havana. The Joint Chiefs even floated the idea of hijacking American passenger planes or staging the destruction of a chartered aircraft, replacing it mid-flight with a drone and detonating it remotely over Cuban waters. Bodies would then be swapped in, wreckage planted, and grieving families were to be paraded before the press to stoke outrage. And with that, the public would be on side, and off to Cuba they would go for a wee bit of regime change. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military authority in the country, not only approved these proposals, but they also formally submitted them to the Secretary of Defense in March 1962. The only thing that stopped it from moving forward was President John F. Kennedy, who upon seeing the plan was, quite understandably, horrified. He rejected it outright, and not long after removed General Lyman Lemonster, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, from his post. And the American people? They had no idea. Operation Northwoods remained buried in classified files for nearly 35 years. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the documents were declassified and the full truth came out, that the US military establishment had seriously considered manufacturing acts of terror against its own citizens to trick the country into war. It wasn't fringe speculation, it was government policy, inches away from being carried out. Number 7. The Tuskegee syphilis study. For 40 years, one of the most shameful experiments in American medical history was carried out in plain sight, and of course, officialdom tried desperately to keep its ugly details firmly under wraps. It began in 1932 and saw the US Public Health Service, the PHS, ostensibly conduct a study in Tuskegee, Alabama, to observe the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men. The researchers, however, had no intention of curing them, even after penicillin became a proven cure in the 1940s. So, how did they blag that, you ask? Well, it was pretty simple. They just didn't bother telling the subjects. 600 African-American sharecroppers, 400 with syphilis, 200 without, that they had syphilis. Nope. Instead, they had bad blood. You see, a suitably vague term that could stretch to cover everything from anemia to chronic fatigue. They were, all of them, tragic and undeserving victims who had been lured into being unwitting guinea pigs for the state with promises of free healthcare, hot meals, and burial insurance. This went on not just into the 40s, as we've already mentioned, it went on for decades into the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s, with the project not ultimately being terminated until 1972, and for that whole time, their deteriorating health, the blindness, the madness, the organ failure, the death was logged and studied, while government doctors and nurses smiled ever politely and drew their blood. The betrayal didn't just stop with them either. Many victims passed the disease unknowingly to their wives, causing some of their children to be born with congenital syphilis. And yet, still, the study continued unchallenged. unpublicized. The lengths they went to keep them infected were truly extreme. For example, when some of the victims were drafted for World War II, where obviously they were bound to come across penicillin at some point, the PHS stepped in, had a little word with the Army Medical Corps and their equivalent in the US Navy, and suddenly, courtesy of some medicalese jargon thrown the victim's way, they'd never be getting any penicillin. Back home also, local clinics were quietly warned not to treat anyone from the study. But to the PHS, this wasn't neglect. Oh no. It was clinical research. Internal voices did speak out against it all, but the second they put their head above the parapet to express their concerns, they were decapitated, fired, and replaced by a more willing yes man. It wasn't until 1972, a full 40 years after it began, that a whistleblower named Peter Buxton didn't try to be nice about it, and he went straight to the press. The outrage was visceral and immediate, which saw the study shut down within mere days. It was too little. Too late, however, as by then, dozens of participants had died unnecessarily, and many more were left with permanent debilitating conditions, which could have easily been nipped in the bud 30 years prior. An apology, for what it was worth at that point, did eventually come in 1997, when President Bill Clinton called the experiment what it was: racist, unethical, indefensible. Number 8. The Gulf of Tonkin lie. Did you know the US went to war based on a lie? We know. It's a statement that's hardly likely to shock anybody in this day and age, given, Iraq. But what may shock you is that it isn't the only time they've done it, as they pulled the exact same ruse before going into Vietnam. The lie in question was spoken in August 1964, when President Lyndon B. Johnson went on national television and told the American people that North Vietnamese forces had launched 2 unprovoked attacks on US Navy ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, portraying the incidents as barefaced aggression on the high seas. Naturally, outrage then followed, and Congress then passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving Johnson full purview to go, fire up the Hueys, and grab the Rolling Stone LP. What the American public didn't know, however, was that the second of those 2 reported attacks, the one that truly convinced Congress and the nation to back escalation, never actually happened. It was a phantom battle conjured by nervous sonar operators, overeager radar readings, and a heavy dose of political expediency. So here's what really occurred. On the 2nd of August 1964, the destroyer USS Maddox did exchange fire with North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. That was the first incident, and it was not exactly what you'd call unprovoked, as the Maddox had been gathering intelligence in coordination with South Vietnamese raids on the North's coast. Then, 2 nights later, on the 4th of August, the Maddox and a second destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, were sailing in the dark, stormy Gulf when they thought they came under attack again. For about 2 hours, the crews maneuvered frantically and opened fire at what they believed were enemy torpedo boats cutting through the waves. But there were no North Vietnamese boats out there that night. The attack was a mirage of faulty radar blips and misinterpreted sonar pings. In fact, come the following morning, the Maddox's captain even reported doubts that any Vietnamese vessels had even been present, and analysts in Washington were finding the reports very suspect too. Yet Johnson and his advisors seized on the confusion and treated it as confirmed. They rushed to Congress with alarmist claims of open aggression, with the truth being quickly swept under the rug as the wheels of war spun up. All of this was rumored about for years, especially as the Vietnam War grew ever more controversial. But there was never quite the evidence needed to prove it beyond all doubt. But then, in 2005, NSA historian Robert Hanyuk, having been elbow-deep in declassified documentation for quite some time, happened upon a landmark finding, a confirmation that that second attack had never happened, and further, the NSA had intentionally obfuscated the truth and skewed reality to twist Johnson's arm into entering the war. And if you happen to be wondering, 58,220 Americans had to die for that lie, as well as many as 3 million Vietnamese. The data needed to be specific with their losses doesn't exist. Number 9. The Patriot Act and mass surveillance. When the smoke cleared after the September the 11th attacks, the US government moved swiftly to strengthen national security, passing within weeks the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act, fortunately shortened to the USA Patriot Act, which granted sweeping new powers to federal agencies for surveillance and detention, allowing the NSA to collect millions of Americans' phone records without a warrant, the FBI to search homes without notifying the occupants, the government to monitor internet activity and emails in in real time, and agents to secretly obtain library or bank records with gag orders forbidding anyone from talking about it. Some naturally worried that these new powers just might be a smidge open to abuse, but Americans were told not to worry, they were only going to be used against the bad guys, so it's all good.
Right.
But within time, sure enough, tiny little clues began to surface that, I know, shock, horror, they were not just being used on the bad guys. A leaked court ruling here, a whistleblower's warning there. But officials routinely insisted that Americans were not being monitored. And we mean that they insisted it quite literally too, as, for example, in March 2013, when asked in a Senate hearing if the NSA was collecting any type of data on millions of Americans, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper simply answered,
"No, sir."
That was, however, as you've no doubt ascertained by now, a lie. Plain and simple. The proof came just a few months later when former NSA contractor Edward Snowden blew the whistle in spectacular fashion, leaking a trove of classified documents that laid bare the astonishing scope of government surveillance. As for the kind of thing that was in that leak, one of the things that came out was a program codenamed PRISM that gave the NSA direct access to major tech companies' servers globally, vacuuming up private users' data, emails, chats, documents, everything. There was also another initiative which collected virtually every American's phone records on a daily basis, logging who called who and when. The Snowden revelations then confirmed what many had long suspected. In the name of security, the government built an elaborate machinery to spy on its own citizenry, largely without their knowledge or consent. A public outcry, or more accurately, absolutely nuclear shitstorm ensued, and ultimately the courts later ruled some of the NSA's activities unlawful, and Congress enacted modest reforms to rein in bulk data collection. And yet, as people do, they moved on to a new controversy, and the anti-Patriot Act fervor soon died down. And as a result, it remains on the books to this very day, with much of its surveillance apparatus still chugging along as it always has for the last 20 or so years. Number 10. The My Lai Massacre. Our final American entry today sees us heading back to Vietnam, because there, on the 16th of March 1968, during the Vietnam War, C Company, 1st Battalion of the 20th Infantry Regiment, U.S. Army, entered a sleepy little hamlet called My Lai, and over the course of a few hours, committed one of the worst atrocities in U.S. military history ever. Then, under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, the troops of C Company swept through My Lai on a routine sweep where they expected to find Viet Cong guerrillas. They found no enemy fighters, however, only unarmed Vietnamese villagers, old men, women, children, even babies. Those people had been getting ready for a market day, and at first didn't panic or run away as they were herded into the hamlet's common spaces. Such things were quite common, after all. Stand over here if you aren't a VC, then the village is nice and clear to do what we need to do. That was the general logic. But then, without warning, without any provocation, the killing started, with that crowd assembled in the common spaces being gunned down where they stood, knelt, or lay. Some were shot in the back as they tried to flee. Others were forced to lie face down in irrigation canals before soldiers opened fire. One group of 70 to 80 villagers, mostly women and children, were slaughtered by Calley personally as he and his men set about them with M16s. There was no resistance. Not a single shot was fired at the Americans that day. The killing went on for roughly 4 hours. The massacre only ended when Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, a helicopter pilot observing from above, saw what was happening, landed his aircraft between US troops and terrified villagers, and threatened to open fire on his fellow soldiers if they didn't stop. He evacuated survivors and later reported what he saw, sparking the chain of events that would eventually bring the massacre to public light. But in the immediate aftermath, the cover-up began almost as soon as the shooting stopped. C Company's officers filed false after-action reports claiming a great victory. 128 Viet Cong combatants killed in a fierce firefight. No mention, of course, that those combatants were actually women, children, and elderly farmers, nor that no US troops were even injured. Many soldiers knew that this was a lie, but that didn't stop an initial inquiry called after the soldiers started talking from being merely perfunctory and finding no evidence of wrongdoing. And that likely would have become the commonly accepted version of events were it not for a former GI named Ron Ridenour, a man of conscience who had heard the grisly eyewitness accounts from fellow soldiers and wrote detailed letters to Congress, the Pentagon, and others demanding an investigation. Around the same time, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh also got wind that Cali was quietly being court-martialed for murder, and having heard the rumors of the massacre himself, Hersh dug until he uncovered the full scope of the massacre and the cover-up, publishing his findings in November 1969, throughout which were horrifying photos taken by army photographer Ron Haber. Faced with global outrage, the Pentagon finally launched a thorough and proper investigation, the Pierce Commission, which confirmed not only the massacre but a systematic cover-up by senior officers. Dozens of officers were found to have failed to report the obvious war crimes or had actively suppressed information. And yet, in the end, accountability was fleeting, as Cali wound up being the only individual convicted for the premeditated murder of 22 villagers, and he served only a brief house arrest before being released. Higher-ranking officers who covered up the massacre received little more than reprimands, if that, leaving perhaps as many as 504 murdered Vietnamese civilians denied even the dignity of justice. Number 11. The Great Leap Forward Famine. Because we don't want to be accused of being biased, let's now move our focus and have a look at the nation that's on the other team, as it were. China. Indeed, their government has no shortage of events that they'd prefer to keep on the down low, with the absolute unmitigated human catastrophe that was the Great Leap Forward being a fantastic first example for us. Launched in 1958 by Chairman Mao Zedong, it was billed as a revolutionary push to rocket China from peasant poverty into modern industrial glory. And Mao wasn't interested in gradual reform or boring 5-year plans. Oh, no. He wanted an instant transformation of China's economy through sheer willpower, human muscle, and of course, plenty of revolutionary zeal. As what actually happens, the scheme saw millions of peasants wrenched from their homes and forced into sprawling people's communes, each the size of a small city, inside of which private property was abolished, communal kitchens were set up, and life basically became one giant ideological boot camp. The goal in doing so? To centralize and streamline agriculture, political education, governance, and even basic living under one collectivized roof. This would free up vital manpower for industrial projects. Those industrial projects were not necessarily to be the giant mega factories that likely spring to mind either, although they were certainly a goal. Instead, industrialization was to be an across-the-board effort, with the peasants who didn't make it into those communes being ordered to build backyard furnaces on their holdings, millions of them, and with them they were to begin melting down everything metal that they could spare, from pots and pans to farming tools, in the hopes of creating usable steel for the coming effort. Meanwhile, when they did actually do some farming, experimental farming methods rooted in pseudoscience were rolled out, like planting seeds ridiculously close together or deep in the soil to encourage solidarity among them. Among the seeds, guys. All of this went about as well as you would expect, and famine soon broke out as the nation's crop yields absolutely collapsed. So much for solidarity. That backyard steel, well, it was barely usable junk. It turns out steel production is a specific skill that requires a specific equipment. Who knew? Worse still, however, it robbed the peasantry of vital labor time that could have been spent working the fields, labor that wasn't exactly used efficiently, courtesy of the new comrade cultivation techniques. And just to compound the disaster further still, thanks to the climate of fear that existed in Maoist China, local officials continued reporting fake bumper harvests anyway, terrified of looking ideologically impure, which could easily lead to the loss of their cushy jobs. And with Beijing believing the country was drowning in grain as a result, the government began seizing surpluses that didn't exist to feed cities, pay off debt, and even export abroad. This wasn't just economic mismanagement, it was state-driven delusion weaponized against its own people. Mao genuinely believed that with enough slogans, forced labor, and ideological fervor, China could outpace the UK in steel production within a few years and join the ranks of global superpowers. What actually happened was the most lethal famine in human history, with maybe as many as, wait for it, 55 million people perishing during it. The CCP naturally launched a comprehensive cover-up of the Great Leap Forward famine, masking widespread death and starvation from both domestic and foreign scrutiny. The state-controlled media was ordered to report only euphemisms like 3 years of difficulties or natural disasters, while any mention of mass hunger, death, or even cannibalism was banned, and internal memorial letters pleading for aid were intercepted and destroyed, with 1,200 such letters being sent to the furnace in Xinjiang alone. Eventually, however, with the coming of Deng Xiaoping as premier in 1978 and the beginning of the rise of China as we know it today, the state did acknowledge that the catastrophe had been their fault. The first of many frank and pragmatic steps that resulted in the current complicated relationship that the nation has with Mao today. Number 12. The Tiananmen Square massacre. The close of our last entry shouldn't be taken to mean that Deng Xiaoping was a saint, however, because while he may have been economically literate, his tenure wasn't exactly lacking in horror that the state wanted swept under the rug. The best example, of course, is the Tiananmen Square massacre of June 1989, when the state turned its guns on its own people and then spent the next several decades pretending that never happened. For nearly 2 months before that fateful date, the broad expanse of Tiananmen Square had been transformed into the epicenter of a nationwide protest movement, one spearheaded by students, but increasingly joined by civil servants, blue-collar workers, even Communist Party members, many of whom were disillusioned by rising corruption, inflation, and a perceived slow pace of reform. Those assembled had no single demand. Some called for democracy, some called for transparency, and some just wanted the price of rice to stabilize. But despite that, they were, all of them, unified by the belief that something had to change. Accordingly, they built encampments, held vigils, and some even erected a makeshift goddess of democracy statue right across from Mao's portrait on the entrance to the Forbidden City. And for a time, it did look like restraint might just win the day. The party leadership was split. Some wanted negotiation, others wanted tanks, and amid that confusion, the protests swelled, eventually peaking at upwards of 1 million people just on Tiananmen Square, with equivalent protests also breaking out in as many as 400 cities across China. But the moderates lost the internal argument, and the order was sent out to clear the square by force. And not force from Beijing's police either. No, the force came from the People's Liberation Army, China's military, which was sent in, with 30 divisions from across China being flown in for the coming crackdown. And so it was that on the evening of the 3rd of June, following a single warning across all radio frequencies to clear Tiananmen Square and its surrounding streets, the troops moved in, some behind the controls of Type 59 tanks and others on foot. When civilians tried to block their advance, they were met not with tear gas or the baton, but with live rounds and an unrelenting advance. Some were shot, others were crushed beneath the treads. Hospitals were overwhelmed, reporters were arrested, cameras were smashed, and in the middle of it all, a sole act of gallantry was captured from afar. A single man, Tank Man, as he has gone down in history, stepping out in front of an entire column of tanks, armed with nothing more than a pair of shopping bags. As for how many were killed in the crackdown, we just don't know. The Chinese government insists that it was no more than 300. The Red Cross once claimed 2,600, and recently declassified British diplomatic communications from the time estimated upwards of 10,000. Naturally, the state moved to erase it all. In the days that followed, the square was scrubbed clean, the tents and banners burned, and the newsreels wiped. Thousands were arrested. Some were executed, libraries were purged, schoolbooks rewritten, and to this day, on the Chinese internet, terms like Tiananmen Massacre, June 4th, and even Tank Man are blocked and liable to get you a knock on the door if you look them up repeatedly. Entire generations have now grown up knowing nothing of what happened, only that they're not supposed to ask. Indeed, even in Hong Kong, an autonomous and supposedly more liberal enclave in China, it remains a very touchy subject for the state, with an annual commemoration of the massacre in Victoria Park that regularly attracted upwards of 100,000 attendees, having been banned in 2020, after which police were deployed en masse to the park on the anniversary, just in case anyone was having a little too much time to think. Number 13. The pandemic's first casualty. The truth. Do you remember back in 2019 when a strange newer illness began claiming victims in the city of Wuhan? Well, something that has largely fallen through the cracks of our collective memory is the length that China went to cover up the early days of the COVID outbreak and present the facade that all was indeed well in the People's Republic, nothing to see here, move along, please. Sometimes this was done through the silencing of medical personnel who were a bit too vocal about it during the initial outbreak, and later the whistleblowers who were determined to spread the word regardless, as the full-scale scale of the coming catastrophe started to become apparent. Take, for instance, Dr. Wen Liang, name that briefly made the rounds before the Chinese censors ensured he'd fade into the background noise. On the 30th of December 2019, he had warned his colleagues in a private chat group about a SARS-like illness spreading in Wuhan, and within days, he was dragged into a police station and forced to sign a statement admitting that he had been spreading rumors and disturbing public order. And, in a bitter twist of irony, just over a month later, he was dead, having fallen victim to the very virus that he had tried to warn the world about. Then there was Dr. A. Fen, the director of the emergency department at the same Wuhan hospital. She was among the first to raise internal concerns about the strange new pneumonia cases that kept rolling in. For her trouble, she was reportedly disciplined by her superiors, forbidden from speaking out again, and later disappeared from public view entirely after giving an interview to a Chinese magazine, an interview that was scrubbed from the internet almost as soon as it was published. And that's just the doctors, because when word started to leak out through other means, Beijing started coming after the citizen journalists too. Chen Qixi, a lawyer turned reporter, went to Wuhan in January 2020 and started posting footage of overrun hospitals and grieving families. By early February, he'd vanished, only to reappear again in September 2021, with no explanation being given to where he had been during his absence. And then there's Fang Bin, a Wuhan resident who posted footage of body bags being loaded into vans, also disappearing shortly after uploading a video with the title, "All the People Revolt, Hand the Power of the Government Back to the People." He disappeared in February 2020, only to surface again in May 2023, again with no explanation being given as to his absence. And consider finally Zhang Zhan, who traveled to Wuhan, posted reports and live streamed the chaos. She was arrested, charged with picking quarrels and provoking trouble, and sentenced to 4 years in prison. She reportedly went on a hunger strike in protest and was force-fed. The campaign of denial and delay proved catastrophic, not just for China, but for the world. By the time that Beijing finally acknowledged the seriousness of the virus and locked down Wuhan on the 23rd of January 2020, the virus had already escaped far beyond city borders and indeed country borders too. These lost early weeks meant lost lives. What might have been a containable local epidemic was allowed to explode into a global pandemic. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that even after the truth became impossible to hide, officials in China spun a narrative of decisive victory and censored discussion of their early failures, because of course they did. Number 14. The Cultural Revolution. Alright, going back to Mao's era now, and to a chapter so chaotic, so viscerally unhinged, that the authorities still wince if you bring it up too loudly: the Cultural Revolution. Branded as a noble effort to cleanse China of old ideas and bourgeois rot, in reality it was a brutal decade-long conflict of iconoclasm against the nation's heritage. You see, following the catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward and its famine that killed tens of millions of people, Mao's prestige took a bit of a massive hit, even within the Communist Party. He remained chairman of the CCP, and thus the man at the top of it all, but in reality, he withdrew from the day-to-day management of the economy and governance, allowing more pragmatic figures like Liu Shaoqi, Zhao Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping to take charge of policy. These men quietly rolled back many of Mao's worst excesses, reinstating private farming in some areas and prioritizing food production over ideological purity, all moves that allowed the economy to slowly recover. Mao, however, festered in the background and found himself increasingly bitter at being sidelined, as well as increasingly convinced that China was slipping back into so-called capitalist tendencies. With that in mind, in 1966, Mao emerged from seclusion and proclaimed the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, to use its proper title. Ostensibly, it was about sweeping away what he dubbed the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. And sure, while it certainly was about them to a degree, as Mao was nothing if not a man of his principles, it was also a very pragmatic move, as what would you know it, political opponents could also be written off as old. Enter the Red Guards. Fervent, brainwashed teenagers clad in red armbands and high on revolutionary rhetoric. Mao unleashed them on society like ideological attack dogs, encouraging them to root out class enemies and counter-revolutionaries wherever they might hide, including their own teachers, neighbors, and parents. This ended exactly how you'd expect. Schools and universities ground to a halt as students abandoned education in favor of street-level inquisitions, beating their professors with broomsticks and parading them around the streets with signs hung from their necks. Museums were also ransacked, libraries torched, and classical literature was fed to a bonfire. Buddha statues they were beheaded. And of course, soon enough, the campaign eventually began turning to murder as the fervor only intensified. Street beatings turned into lynchings, forced confessions turned into executions, and entire families were torn apart by teenage mobs convinced they were saving the soul of the revolution. Some regions fell into near civil war, with rival Red Guard factions turning on each other in blood-soaked turf battles to prove who was the most ideologically pure. But nowhere descended quite so far into horror as Guangxi province, the scene of one of the most grotesque episodes of the entire Cultural Revolution, the Guangxi massacre. There, particularly between 1967 and 1968, the killings weren't just indiscriminate, they were industrial. Tens of thousands of people were executed as class enemies in public purges, often without even the pretense of a trial. Victims included teachers, former landowners, civil servants, and even children whose parents had been labeled reactionary. And in some areas, the violence escalated into something even darker. According to now declassified internal party investigations, some cadres and militia units in Guangxi went so far as to practice ritual cannibalism, claiming it was a revolutionary act, with the organs of the executed sometimes being harvested and consumed by their killers in what were later described chillingly as revolutionary banquets. Eyewitness accounts from the time speak of villagers being forced to participate, of school children watching as their own headmasters were butchered, and of entire communities gripped by mass psychosis. The political purges were just as vicious too. High-ranking officials were accused of betrayal, tortured into confessions, and cast out like garbage. Liu Shaoqi, once Mao's own number 2, was among them. After being publicly humiliated, he was thrown into solitary confinement, denied medical care, and left to die in prison. Eventually, with even Mao having to concede that things were getting a little bit out of hand come 1967, the genie had to be put back in the bottle, with those tasked with doing it being the People's Liberation Army, who were dispatched to put the Red Guards down quickly, cleanly, and violently. The process took until mid-1968, and in fact, the only reason that this isn't considered something of a mini-civil war of sorts, with pitched battles between the military and Red Guards not exactly being uncommon, is because it turns out that soldiers are just a smidge harder than students, and so the Red Guards invariably ended up getting steamrolled when shots were exchanged. The Cultural Revolution more broadly, however, technically stayed policy until Mao finally died in 1976, although post the purging of the Red Guards, it was but a shell of its former self, and in many ways, a policy in name only. So how does the modern Chinese state explain all this? Well, it does so very carefully. The official line is that a radical faction known as the Gang of Four hijacked the movement and led it astray, a narrative that neatly sidesteps the fact that Mao himself was the one who lit the match. But that does mean that the events themselves are not proactively covered up a la Tiananmen, and accordingly, you can happily find Chinese websites that discuss it in perfect detail. Indeed, if you go on a tour of the Ming Dynasty tombs outside of Beijing, your tour guide won't give a second thought to pointing to the vandalized parts and saying words to the extent of, "Boy, weren't the Red Guards just a little bit mental." Number 15. The one-child policy and forced abortions. For our final China entry, let's take a look at a policy so bleak, so systematically dehumanizing, that even today, the state would much rather you focus on the economic miracle of the period rather than the bodies it trampled to get there: the one-child policy. Basically, from 1980 to 2016, China imposed what was essentially reproductive authoritarianism, limiting most families to a single child in the name of population control. Officially, it was presented as a noble sacrifice for the greater good, a grand scheme to lift China out of poverty. In practice, it meant that millions of women lived in fear of the knock on the door and of the gut-wrenching decisions that would be forced upon them if they dared to get pregnant a second time. And we really do mean fear too, because if you got pregnant without permission, especially in rural areas where enforcement was often left to brutal, self-interested local officials, you could find yourself dragged into a clinic, injected with a poison that would stop your baby's heart, and forced to deliver the corpse, among other various ways that pregnancies could be, and were, forcibly aborted. One case in particular, however, briefly shattered the state-sanctioned illusion that this was all in aid of some common good, and that would be the case of Feng Jiangmei. She found herself pregnant with her second child in 2012, and after local officials became aware, around 7 months after conceiving, they demanded that she pay a 40,000 yuan fine, that's around $5,500, and when she couldn't afford to do so, she was forcibly restrained and injected with an abortion agent, ending the life of the child whom Jian Mei already had a name picked out for and a bedroom decorated and ready to go. This absolutely broke Jian Mei, and absolutely incensed her with rage. A family posted pictures of her beside her aborted child to Weibo, a Chinese microblogging site, and from there the story went nuclear, quickly going viral before state censors could nip it in the bud. And no, we're not going to show you the picture. More broadly too, the collateral damage of this policy was catastrophic. A traditional cultural preference for sons led to millions of baby girls being aborted, abandoned, or even killed, resulting in one of the most warped sex ratios on Earth, with China by the 2000s having tens of millions more men than women, a demographic time bomb born not of fate, but of cold and callous bureaucracy. And then, after all that, the state ended up doing a total about-turn in 2016, abolishing the policy and replacing it with the two-child policy the following year, and then raising it again with the three-child policy of 2021, and then essentially scrapping it later that same year when all punitive measures for exceeding limits were removed. It turns out that the people of China were, of their own volition, doing what every populace on Earth does when it strikes it rich, choosing to have less children. And as a result, rather ironically, China's new issue is that it won't have enough children to sustain future growth. And what's worse, entirely by Beijing's own doing, because they failed to predict this very obvious turn, their population is already down tens of millions from where it would be if they'd done nothing at all. But of course, you won't find much soul-searching in the official narrative. Instead, Beijing spent decades blagging its way through the damage, plastering over the cracks with shiny slogans about population modernization and economic harmony, while scrubbing out the stories of forced abortions, sterilizations, and state-backed brutality. Coercion was rebranded as family planning, trauma dismissed as isolated incidents, and any local horror story was promptly blamed on overzealous officials rather than the policy itself. Propaganda posters glorified one-child families, while dissenting voices were silenced, censored, or disappeared entirely. And when the whole thing began unraveling, when it became obvious that China's birth rate was in freefall and that the country was staring down the barrel of a self-inflicted demographic collapse, there was no apology, no reckoning, just a quiet pivot to encouraging more births. Number 16. The Holodomor. Staying with communism for our next country of focus, let's now turn to the Soviet Union. Yes, we know it doesn't exist anymore, but while it was around, its government featured no shortage of lying, covering up, and just outright evil. And nowhere was that more apparent than in one of, if not the, most grotesquely cruel episodes in its long catalogue of repression, the Holodomor, a man-made famine that ravaged Soviet Ukraine in 1932 and 1933, killing millions, not by accident or by incompetence, but as a matter of deliberate policy. It began when Joseph Stalin, determined to stamp out Ukrainian nationalism and force rapid collectivization, imposed impossibly high grain quotas on the region's farmers, quotas that were enforced with fanatical militant zeal. And when villagers couldn't meet them, armed brigades moved in and confiscated everything, not just the harvests, but the seed grain, the livestock, even household food stores. Those who resisted were branded kulaks, a Soviet slur for supposedly wealthy peasants, and either deported or executed. Meanwhile, entire districts were blacklisted, meaning that they got no food aid, no trade, no escape. Barbed wire was rolled out, roads were barricaded, and as winter arrived, the breadbasket of Europe became a giant open-air prison, a death camp in all but name. What happened next was nothing short of apocalyptic. As hunger set in, people turned to tree bark, to weeds, to stray animals, in a desperate attempt just to stay alive. Others, however, crossed a darker line altogether, resorting to cannibalism. Soviet archives reveal at least 2,500 convictions for this, but the real number, of course, is unknowable. All told, estimates for the number of Ukrainians who died often reach as many as 5 million. And the worst part, Stalin knew, and he didn't care. While Ukrainians starved, his Soviet Union kept exporting grain abroad to maintain the illusion of strength and prosperity. Foreign aid offers, which began to trickle in once word got out, were turned away. Domestically, the famine was declared a non-event. Anyone speaking of it risked prison or worse. Abroad, useful idiots in the Western press, most notably New York Times correspondent Walter Duranty, dutifully parroted Moscow's denials, dismissing the mounting reports of starvation as exaggerated. It was easily one of the most horrific state-sponsored atrocities of the 20th century, a century that's not exactly lacking for competition in that regard, and for decades it was buried beneath Soviet propaganda, a human catastrophe that was known about, sure, but whose full horror would never see the light of day until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and objective-minded historians managed to finally get into the Kremlin archives. Number 17. The Katyn massacre. Tragically, the Ukrainians were far from the only peoples to suffer under the Soviets' boots, as the Poles, quite frankly, were subjected to nothing short of abject barbarism during the Soviets' various attempts to bring them to heel. And no better is this exemplified than with the Katyn massacre, a story of state-sponsored murder and one of the most audacious cover-ups in modern history. It happened between April and May 1940 under direct orders from both Stalin and his Politburo, and saw the NKVD, the Soviet Union's secret police, execute 21,857 Polish military officers, police, border guards, and intelligentsia, basically anyone who might have something to say about the Soviets' occupation of the eastern half of Poland, or have the hardware and know how to do something about it. The victims were detained as prisoners at first, held in camps in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov before, after a suitably large number had been detained, then taking them to execution sites at the Katyn Forest, Tver, Kharkiv, Medonia, and Bykivnia, all of them within the Soviet hinterland, where they were murdered en masse, with each prisoner either being led into a soundproofed room or taken into the woods, hands often bound behind their back, and shot once in the back of the head at point-blank range, typically with a German-made 25 caliber Walther pistol, chosen specifically because Soviet revolvers, heavy as they were, tended to make the executioner's wrist's ache after a dozen or so murders. Then the bodies were dumped in mass graves, layer upon layer, with sites having been prepared well in advance. It was cold, industrial, and staggeringly efficient, with one NKVD executioner, Vasily Blokhin, personally having killed thousands during those weeks of slaughter. And they'd have gotten away with it too, with the details of the murders falling to the bottom of the Kremlin archives, only to be discovered following the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, were it not for Nazi Germany's invasion in 1941, a fact which is nothing but macabrely ironic given that regime's own near unspeakable crimes against Poland. They discovered it in 1943, stumbling upon the mass graves in the Katyn forest during their ongoing campaigns in the area, and invited Red Cross observers to oversee their exhumations, who confirmed that the victims had indeed been shot in spring 1940, well before German occupation of the area. The Soviets, for their part, after Germany naturally started putting the discovery to work in their propaganda, reacted with a lie, blaming the Nazis and claiming the massacres in fact occurred in 1941. Western allies, desperate to keep Stalin appeased, publicly accepted the Soviet version, although in private, very strong doubts were often shared. Ultimately, they stuck to that line, and it took 50 years for Moscow to admit guilt, with that admission and subsequent change in the official story not coming until 1990, when Mikhail Gorbachev held his hand up to it all, following discoveries made by Soviet historians deep in the Kremlin archives. Number 18. The mass deportations. The Soviet Union boasted of being harmonious, a federation of equal nations. But you know, when they say to judge a man by his actions rather than his words, well, turns out you can apply that same logic to authoritarian regimes too, because despite all of that talk, all of the sloganeering of terms like friendship of the peoples and workers of the world unite, actually the Soviet Union thought nothing of treating its minorities like mere industrial resources, goods to be used, abused, and discarded, all at the behest of the state. And no better is this exemplified than with the many, many mass deportations it undertook in its early years. Basically, from the 1930s through to the early 1950s, Stalin's government, with assistance from the ever-helpful NKVD, embarked on a spree of creating so-called special settlers, i.e. people who were dragged from their homes kicking and screaming and forced to relocate at gunpoint, usually to the most remote regions of the Soviet Union. Siberia, remote Kazakhstan, places like that. The first such operation, which lasted from 1930 to 1937, was actually not targeted towards a racial minority, but rather a class one, the so-called kulaks, who were basically just peasants who had the audacity to not be living entirely hand-to-mouth, with the kulaks in question usually being Russian and occasionally Ukrainian. It is believed that around 2.5 million such people were forcibly deported, with the number of them that perished due to exposure, malnutrition, or just the brutality of their captors being just shy of 400,000 people. After that, however, with Stalin having whetted his palate, the deportations did start to become racially targeted, with around 172,000 ethnic Koreans being deported from the Russia Far East to Central Asia, suspected without any evidence of being secret Japanese agents. The NKVD didn't bother to record any figures for the number of them that perished, but did estimate that their mortality rate hovered at anywhere between 10 and 16%. Then it was the turn of the Volga Germans, who, despite having lived peacefully in Russia since the 18th century, were deported en masse after Nazi invasion. Men, women, children, children the lot. No trial, no appeal, just guilt by bloodline. As many as 440,000 of them were deported, and as many as 250,000 of that number would perish. And then, between late 1943 and early 1944, the machine was kicked into overdrive with the targeting of a slew of new ethnic groups, including the Kalmyks from southwestern Russia. Over 90,000 were exiled in the dead of winter, and around 1 in 6 didn't survive. The Karachays and Balkars, Turkic minorities, also from the southwest of Russia, specifically the Turkish border, funnily enough, and as many as 46,000 of them perished. The Chechens and Ingush from the North Caucasus, nearly 500,000 of them were rounded up in just 2 days surrounding Operation Lentil. Stuffed into filthy cattle cars with little food or water, many succumbed to disease and exposure en route. In one especially horrific case, 700 villagers in Kaibach were locked inside a barn and burned alive because the snow made it too difficult to transport them. Estimates for the total number of dead vary massively, anywhere from 120,000 to 420,000 or so. The Crimean Tatars from the Black Sea Peninsula, branded en masse as Nazi collaborators in May 1944, around 190,000 were deported to Uzbekistan, and it's believed that they suffered as many as 110,000 deaths during their exile. All told, these deportations affected over 6 million people, as many as a quarter of which may have perished. And yet, despite the staggering scale and horror of these operations, the Soviet state went to great lengths to pretend that none of it really happened, at least not the way people experienced it. In official records and press releases, these mass deportations were not violent purges, but necessary security measures, voluntary resettlements that saw the peoples in question get better jobs and living conditions, or just good old-fashioned enthusiastic comrades happy to take one on the chin and do their best for socialist construction. Number 19. The downing of KAL 007. In the early hours of the 1st of September 1983, a commercial airliner packed with families, children, and even a sitting US congressman was shot down by the Soviets, and of course, they tried to cover it up. The flight in question was Korean Airlines Flight 007, and it was heading for Seoul from New York with a little stop-off in Anchorage for refueling. To begin with, all was well. It was just another routine, unremarkable flight. But then, at 15:51, disaster began to unfold as, completely unbeknownst to the crew, a navigational error had seen them stray nearly 500 kilometers off course right into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. And in case you didn't know, back in the Soviet days, their airspace was closed to all but a select handful of airlines. Cue panic from the Soviets, who, after having a surprising challenge in actually intercepting the thing, had 3 Su-15s and a single MiG-23 within visual range of it. One of those pilots was Major Gennady Osipovich, behind the stick of one of the Su-15s. He knew straight away that it was a 747, the 2 rows of windows being quite the giveaway, but he failed to report this fact to ground control because, quote, they didn't ask. Although attempts were made to contact the lumbering jet, everything from flashing lights to firing warning shots past it, 400 rounds worth, by the way, and attempting to reach it over the radio, none of this caused the plane to respond. Such efforts ultimately were moot, however, because when ground control became paranoid that it could be an American RC-135 reconnaissance plane, the order was given to destroy it. Osipovich didn't think twice about dropping behind it and firing 2 K-8 air-to-air missiles right at it, reasoning that even if ground control were wrong, quote, I knew this was a civilian plane, but for me, this meant nothing. It is easy to turn a civilian type of plane into one for military use. The first missile likely struck near the left wing, destroying control surfaces and pressurization systems. The second is believed to have exploded near the tail. The aircraft didn't explode immediately, but began a slow, spiraling descent. Inside the cockpit, the crew had just seconds to respond before their system started failing. The plane lost cabin pressure, avionics went dark, and for the next 12 minutes, Flight 007 remained airborne, uncontrolled, before eventually crashing into the Sea of Japan, just off of Monaran Island. All 269 people on board were killed instantly. The Soviet response, when the reality of what they'd done dawned, was deflection. First, they denied everything, and for good measure, they also withheld the black box flight recorder to obfuscate the coming investigation, as well as also lying about the findings of their search and rescue team, saying they had found nothing, when actually they had found plenty of wreckage, plenty of bodies, and even documentation from the victims. Eventually, they changed their tact, admitting that they did shoot it down, but claiming that it was a deliberate provocation by the United States to probe the Soviet Union's military preparedness, or even provoke a war. And from there, the situation petered out. They sat out the international outcry and were left thinking they'd gotten away with it, which indeed they kinda did, but only for a decade, as in 1993, newly independent Russia admitted to what the whole world already knew. The flight was a civilian one. It had simply strayed off course due to a navigational error, and they shot it down erroneously. Number 20. The suppression of the Prague Spring. For our final Soviet entry, let's look back to 1968, the moment when the Kremlin decided to crush the hope of an entire nation under the treads of its tanks. The nation in question was Czechoslovakia, which had until then quietly done as it was told behind the Iron Curtain. But that all changed in January of that year when reformist leader Alexander Dubček took the reins of power on the back of a growing wave of discontent with the nation's communist rule. His solution? To give communism a makeover, calling his vision socialism with a human face. And for a time, this saw censorship be loosened, public debates be allowed, and even the sharp edge of the secret police be dulled ever so. It was modest and moderate stuff, to be sure, especially when you consider that fundamentally Dubček did not want to overthrow communist rule at all. Quite the opposite, in fact, as he was quite the hammer and sickle enjoyer in his time. To Moscow, however, such realities mattered not. Dubček's actions were seen as a threat to their authority, to their hegemon in the region, and therefore an example had to be made of him. And so it was that in the early hours of the 21st of August, hundreds of thousands of troops stormed across the border, with Moscow having made specific point to draw troops from the wider Warsaw Pact so that the invasion could be framed as the communist world, as a collective standing up to Dubček and telling him that what he was up to was out of order. The Czechoslovak army, however, given the vast number of tanks looming upon Prague and paratroopers landing at Regeni airport, stood down. Dubček was no fool. He knew there was simply no defeating such a decisive action from Moscow, so why spill his countrymen's blood in pursuit of an unachievable goal? The ordinary Czechoslovak people, however, turned out they didn't mind risking a bit of a rumble with their occupiers, as in the face of the invasion, they collectively said, well, that, and flooded the streets in protest, forming human chains, flipping road signs to confuse the tanks, and just simply shouting some good old-fashioned abuse. In fact, as you can see from this photo, a few of the more enthusiastic protesters even firebombed a tank or two. For their resistance, however, when all was said and done, 137 Czechoslovaks paid the ultimate price. Eventually, Dubček and his government were seized and flown to Moscow, and there they were persuaded to walk everything back. Reform was deadly, and correspondingly, a new pro-Soviet leader was installed. Censorship returned, dissent was quietly, or not so quietly at times, crushed, and suddenly, seemingly as quick as it had sprung up, the lid was closed on Pandora's box, and the status quo returned to Czechoslovakia. Eager to cover the reality of the matter up, that it was all just a matter of hegemon preservation, the Soviet Union stuck to its pre-prepared line. It wasn't an invasion. It was just a bit of fraternal assistance to save Czechoslovakia from counter-revolution. For 2 decades, that was the story, and speaking otherwise could cost you everything. School books were rewritten, journalists gagged, memorials banned, and even public discussion of 1968 was declared off limits. The Prague Spring became something spoken about only in whispers, if at all. It wasn't until the Velvet Revolution of 1989, which saw Czechoslovakia free itself from its Marxist bondage, that the truth was allowed to come roaring back into the light. Number 21, the Beslan school siege. For our next country of focus, let us move on to have a look at the Soviet Union's main successor state, Russia, because it too isn't exactly what you'd call a nation lacking dirty laundry. And no better is this demonstrated than with its response to one of the most horrific terrorist incidents in history, the Beslan school siege. It began on the 1st of September 2004, the first day of the school year, incidentally, when 32 armed militants stormed school number 1 in the siege's titular town. They struck at 11 minutes past 9 in the morning exactly, and wasted no time setting about their wicked task, dropping security guards where they stood, as well as anyone else brave enough to try and resist, before they then started herding nearly 1,200 people, among which were 777 children, into the school gymnasium at gunpoint. Then they started rigging the place with explosives, many attached to various tripwires or dead man switches laced between the terrified hostages. From there, the temperature began to increase, both literally and figuratively, with the temperature soaring to sweltering levels thanks to the now sealed doors and windows. The hostage takers, a mix of Chechen and English extremists, executed anyone who resisted or quibbled, as well as between 15 and 20 of the adult men they deemed the strongest, who were gunned down by automatic rifle fire early in the proceedings. Attempts at negotiation, however, proved feeble at best. On day 2, for example, former English President Ruslan Olshev was allowed to enter and secured the release of just 26 women and children, a token gesture given the incredible number still trapped inside. And all the while, Russian officials grossly underreported the number of hostages, initially claiming there were only 354 inside, a figure that fueled confusion, hampered rescue planning, and left desperate families outside feeling deceived. Then came day 3, the 3rd of September, and with it, disaster. Between 1 and 1:05 p.m., two powerful explosions ripped through the school, the sources of which are still unclear and heavily disputed, and the uneasy standoff erupted into violence in an instant. The hostage-takers opened fire immediately, outwards toward the gathered military forces and, of course, the hostages. From there, the military returned fire, and some of the hostages attempted to flee, only to be cut down in the crossfire. From there was pandemonium. Taken completely by surprise, conflicting orders over the radio meant that some of the military began storming into the building, supported by tanks, APCs, and even an attack helicopter, while others held their grounds and others still turned and fled. When the smoke finally cleared and the guns fell silent, 334 hostages were dead, including 186 children. Hundreds more were wounded, and the school itself was reduced to a charred ruin. Of the 32 attackers, 31 were killed, and the one survivor, Nur Pashi Kuleyev, would later be tried and sentenced to life. Moscow's official narrative painted its forces as saviors battling fanatics, a best realistic outcome type scenario. But survivors and victims' families tell a more damning story, one of botched negotiations, needless delays, and indiscriminate fire that may have killed more hostages than terrorists, and to this day, no high-ranking Russian official has been held responsible for the disaster, and in fact, the only accountability at all has been reserved for a few local police officers. And that's it. Number 22. The assassination of Alexander Litvinenko. London's Millennium Hotel, now called the Biltmore, had always been a place that glimmers with genteel luxury. But on the 1st of November 2006, its refined surroundings were to be the stage for a most macabre performance: the assassination of one of the Kremlin's top critics. The target was one Alexander Litvinenko, a former Soviet and later Russian intelligence officer who fled for the West and sought asylum back in the year 2000. And on that fateful day, he'd simply been having tea with two ex-KGB acquaintances, nothing more, nothing less. Or so he thought anyway, because unbeknownst to him, the teapot had been spiked with polonium-210, a particular isotope that is comparatively safe and hard to detect normally thanks to its comparatively low gamma radiation output. But it is absolutely lethal when it's ingested or inhaled thanks to its intense alpha radiation output. As a result, Litvinenko fell violently ill within mere hours and then spent 3 agonizing weeks wasting away in a London hospital bed, hair fallen out, skin yellowed, poisoned by radiation, before he finally died, becoming the world's first confirmed victim of polonium-induced radiation syndrome. From his deathbed, Litvinenko accused one man above all else of ordering his murder, Vladimir Putin. The evidence to support his claim didn't take long to find either, as soon enough British investigators had followed a radioactive breadcrumb trail across London, from teacups to hotel sinks to airplane seats. This all led straight to the 2 Russian men who had met Litvinenko that day, Andrei Lugovy and Dmitry Kovtun. The 2 men, however, were gone from the UK before Litvinenko's body was even cold, and so they totally escaped justice, with the British extradition requests that followed being swiftly refused by the Russian government, citing a constitutional prohibition on handing over its own citizens. And speaking of the Russian government, back home, while both suspects who escaped justice, Lugovoy, the man who is believed to have poured the polonium into Litvinenko's tea, appears to have been proactively rewarded, having been swiftly elected to the Russian State Duma in 2007 under the nationalist LDPR banner, before later being awarded the Order of Honor by Putin in 2015. The international fallout, however, was immediate and damning. In 2016, a British public inquiry led by retired High Court Judge Sir Robert Owen concluded that Litvinenko's murder had been a Russian state operation, most likely approved at the highest levels, probably even by Putin personally. This was a sentiment echoed by the European Court of Human Rights in 2021. Moscow's response: denial, deflection, derision. The Kremlin dismissed the inquiry as politically motivated, and that, in real terms, was the end of the matter, as it wasn't like foreign powers had the means to actually do anything about it. Fingers were wagged, relations with Russia were further strained, a sanction or two was put in here and there, and that's it. Russia, in real terms, had murdered one of its political dissidents on foreign soil and completely gotten away with it. Number 23. The Navalny poisoning. Another political assassination now, or more correctly, an attempted one. Because in August 2020, Alexei Navalny, Russia's most prominent opposition figure, boarded a domestic flight over Siberia and collapsed mid-air, screaming in agony. The culprit? Novichok, a Soviet-designed nerve agent that is easily amongst the most lethal substances known to man. It took hold quickly. One minute he was fine, sipping his tea and schmoozing with the cabin crew, and the next he was screaming in agony, collapsing in the aisle as horrified passengers looked on. The pilot made an emergency landing in Omsk, Tomsk, and Navalny was stretchered off to a local hospital, barely clinging to life. From there, with that local hospital finding itself rather out of its depth, Navalny was flown to the Berlin University of Medicine Hospital, and it was them who discovered the Novichok in his system clear as day. That discovery alone filled in most of the blanks, as Novichok, as you've likely already guessed from how we introduced it, isn't exactly the kind of thing you pick up at your local pharmacy. It is a highly controlled, internationally outlawed nerve agent from the Soviet Union. So yes, no Navalny's poisoning was likely the doing of the Russian government. He survived, miraculously, and soon started to point his finger squarely at the Kremlin. And perhaps unsurprisingly, their response was to deny, and then deny it again just for good measure. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, for example, dismissed the accusations outright, saying that they absolutely cannot be true, and claiming further that the Russian government had yet to see any evidence of Novichok in Navalny's system, and so there were no grounds for an investigation. Putin himself also weighed in at a December 2020 press conference, and again he shot the charges down, claiming they were but a trick to attack the leaders of Russia, as well as revenge and an attempt to influence public opinion in our country to try to interfere in our domestic politics. Curiously, however, he then stated that Navalny was an asset of US intelligence agencies, with the idea that he would be right to attempt to kill him very much being suggested therefrom, which is nothing if not a bold line of argumentation. TLDR then, it was the standard Russian government tactic when they get caught with their pants down. Deny till the cows come home, knowing full well that while pearls may be clutched and jimmies may indeed be rustled internationally, ultimately nothing real is ever going to come of it, because Putin can always just straddle a nuclear weapon Dr. Kong style, extend his middle finger firmly in the direction of the West and proclaim, "What the f*** you gonna do about it, bitch?" As for Navalny, he wasn't done just yet, not by a long stretch in fact, because against all common sense and advice, he returned to Russia in January 2021, back to the country that had very clearly just tried to kill him. Because in his own words, quote, "I would not give Putin the gift of not returning to Russia." Predictably, after his absolute balls of steel set off every metal detector in Moscow airport, he was arrested almost immediately, at which point charges as varied and diverse as fraud, extremism, contempt, you name it, appeared, and he was sentenced to a total of 30.5 years behind bars. Not that it ever finished that sentence, because he passed away in February 2024, with what Moscow claimed was a supposed sudden onset illness of some kind, and absolutely not an assassination. Deny. Number 24. The MH17 shootdown. On the 17th of July 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was cruising peacefully at 33,000 feet, halfway between Amsterdam and Kuala Lumpur over the skies of eastern Ukraine, and then it vanished from the radar, breaking apart in an instant and raining bodies and wreckage alike over the fields below. All 298 people on board were killed, among them 80 children. The cause of the disaster became clear soon enough. A surface-to-air missile, a Russian-made Buk system to be precise, launched from territory held by pro-Russian separatists during the war in the Donbass. Evidence, including missile fragments with serial numbers, intercepted communications, satellite imagery, and even potential photos of the exact launcher that took the shot, soon emerged, and between them, they all pointed to a single conclusion. The weapon had come from Russia, and was more likely than not fired by its 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, operating in Ukraine, debadged, as it were. And as all of that evidence continued to mount, Moscow launched a retaliatory campaign of denial and disinformation. In the hours and days that followed, for example, Russian state media gave reality-grounded explanations like Ukraine having shot down the plane by accident, more out-there suggestions like Ukraine having intentionally shot it down as a false flag to promote a wider war with Russia, and even full-on tinfoil hat ones like when a rebel commander by the name of Igor Girkin got in front of a camera and suggested that MH17 had been loaded with corpses, again as part of a false flag. These explanations weren't just laughable, they were deliberately contradictory, designed not to convince, but to confuse. The idea wasn't to replace the truth with a lie, but to bury it beneath so many conflicting lies that the average onlooker would throw up their hands and say, "Who the hell knows anymore?" They also weren't above just straight-up fabricating evidence too. Russia's Channel 1, for instance, broadcast this fake satellite photo supposedly showing a Ukrainian fighter jet firing a missile at MH17. Then there was this flight path map produced by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which claimed the aircraft had veered wildly off course into restricted airspace, as well as this supposed radar data again released by the Russian Ministry of Defense, which it claimed showed a Ukrainian Su-25 jet tailing MH17 just before it was shot down. That claim, in particular was nothing if not a bold one, given that Su-25s are ground pounders that, while yes, can carry air-to-air ordnance, in reality just never do, with the type only having a single air-to-air kill in its entire 44-year service history, and even then, it was a friendly-fire cock-up using an air-to-ground dumb rocket. Mercifully, however, while lies such as those were being brewed up by Moscow, the true reality of the matter became increasingly stubborn and apparent, chiefly thanks to Dutch-led joint investigation team who spent years properly piecing it all together, literally, in fact, as they even went to the length of reconstructing the wreckage of MH17 to help with their investigation. And from there, with the facts now established as we first laid them out at the start of this entry, you know exactly what consequences befell Moscow. Some sanctions, some finger-wagging, and that's about it. I.e., nothing of substance at all. Number 25. The Wagner Group's crimes abroad. Our final Russian entry takes us to war zones in Syria, Africa, and beyond, because there, the Wagner Group, a Moscow-aligned PMC outfit, has left a trail of atrocities cloaked by systematic denial. In Syria, for example, chilling footage emerged in 2017 showing Wagner fighters torturing a deserter from Assad's army, beating him with a sledgehammer, crushing his chest, decapitating him, burning his body, and hanging severed limbs for display. That video, allegedly shared on Wagner channels, led to the first ever legal complaint in Moscow against the shadowy group, yet the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, dismissed it as not an issue for the Putin administration, asserting it had no connection to official Russian operations. In Africa, their violence only escalated. Consider in Mali, where UN investigators and Human Rights Watch alike have both attributed massacres to joint operations by Malian forces and Wagner. The 2022 siege of Mora alone resulted in more than 300 civilian deaths in just 5 days, with executions, torture, and mass graves reported. Similar horrors were documented in Dangao Toro, where over 35 Fulani men were bound, executed, and burned, and then dumped in mass graves, and in Hombori, where roughly 50 civilians were shot in a market, hundreds detained, with prisoners later tortured and killed in custody. Then in June 2024, the Abibara massacre left at least 70 Tuareg villagers dead, wells poisoned, and villages looted across a 40-kilometer radius. And yet, every time, Moscow's response is the same. Deny, deflect, or blame Western disinformation, I suppose, like this. In the Central African Republic, for example, when survivors and UN experts began naming massacres like the cruel killings in Agabado in January 2022, where at least 65 civilians were gunned down by both Wagner and government forces, Moscow's response was a rehearsed denial. Meanwhile, in parliamentary exchanges, foreign ministry representatives downplayed the violence, offering that accusations were nothing more than Western disinformation aimed at undermining operations and discrediting Russia's honest help. Similarly, when the UN documented the Hombori massacre we mentioned earlier, both Malian and Wagner spokespeople denied it outright. They claimed the operation was a successful anti-terror raid that neutralized dozens of fighters. The Russian Foreign Ministry chimed in shortly after, affirming that reports of massacres were disinformation, asserting that Mali's military acted within its counter-terror mandate. Even in areas of clear outrage like the siege of Mora, the Kremlin blocked investigations. Russia, with China, vetoed a UN Security Council proposal to probe Wagner-linked abuses in Mali, calling it premature, while Mali claimed it was handling the matter itself. Across the board, then, the script is consistent. Wagner perpetrated rape, torture, mutilation, burning, and killing, all brushed aside as mere distortions, smears, or fabrications. Number 26. The Girl in the Blue Bra. And now it's time for us to move on to another country of focus for 5 more entries. This time, it's Egypt's turn to have its dirty laundry aired, beginning with the case of an unidentified woman who has gone down in history simply as the girl in the blue bra. Now, this story begins at a protest in Cairo's Tahrir Square in December 2011, where, with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces having assumed power following the ousting of President Hosni Mubarak earlier that same year, people had gathered to demand, among other things, electoral reform, an end to the state of emergency, and for power to be returned to civilians. Among the demonstrators was a young woman in a black robe. When security forces marched in to disperse the gathering, unleashing a volley of tear gas and baton rounds alike that they followed up with nightsticks, she ran like everyone else. but then she tripped and fell. At this point, she was swarmed and beaten and stomped mercilessly. So savage was the onslaught that not even her modesty was to be spared, as her robe too was yanked away, revealing the garment after which she would be named in lieu of proper identification. This poor woman, half naked and brutalized on the pavement as she was, became an instant rallying symbol for resistance to the ongoing violence and humiliation that Egyptians faced at the hands of their rulers, and an enormous backlash was provoked as a result. The regime had taken a smoldering tinderbox and poured petrol on it. Thousands of Egyptian women poured into Tahrir Square over the coming days with chants of "Egypt's women are a red line." All the way back in March of that same year, when just weeks after Mubarak was toppled, a group of women staged a protest again in Tahrir Square on International Women's Day, demanding equal rights and representation in post-revolution Egypt. It had barely gotten underway before it was set upon by a mob of men hurling insults and fists. As for the matter of the girl in the blue bra and the consequences therefrom, well, there wasn't really, to be honest. The follow-up protest, one which was labelled by some as the largest demonstration by Egyptian women in a long time, petered out, and that's about it. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces did eventually apologise for all that such a gesture was worth, but even that was begrudging, coming only after Hillary Clinton, then serving as the head of the US Department of State, personally and publicly commented on the matter. Number 27, forced virginity tests. And our next entry sees us remaining at Tahrir Square to look at another abjectly abhorrent violation of Egyptian women's dignity in the form of forced, so-called virginity tests. It happened on the 9th of March 2011, just a few weeks after the toppling of Mubarak, during what should have been a moment of national transformation. Protesters had gathered once more in Tahrir Square, as they did a lot in those days, demanding accountability and resisting the creeping authoritarianism of the military council that had assumed power in the dictator's absence. But when the army moved to clear the square, they didn't just detain demonstrators. They made a point of targeting the women specifically. 17 were arrested that day, and all of them were taken to the Egyptian Museum, which the army had converted into a temporary detention center, and once there, they were beaten, shocked with stun batons, and then lined up for one final humiliation. One by one, they were subjected to invasive state-ordered virginity tests carried out by a military doctor with the clear knowledge of those in command. The women were told that if they refused to comply, as many did to begin with, they would be charged with prostitution, which at the time could warrant a custodial sentence of up to 3 years. And that's to say nothing of the immense, almost certainly life-altering social stigma that would accompany it. When word of this first got out, the Egyptian authorities denied everything, but then the victims spoke out, and the story, horrific as it was, refused to die. Human rights groups picked it up too, and eventually, with pressure mounting, the military was forced to respond. Said response came in June 2011 from none other than Major General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, then head of military intelligence and later Egypt's president, and he admitted to Amnesty International that yes, the tests had taken place, and his defense was that they were necessary to protect the soldiers from future rape allegations. One brave woman named Samira Ibrahim, however, refused to accept such a piss-poor apology and took the military to court in December 2011, a suit that she won, after which virginity tests were ruled unconstitutional and the army was ordered to cease the practice, a rare, if largely symbolic, legal victory in a post-revolution landscape increasingly hostile to dissent. Number 28. The murder of Giulio Regeni. On the 25th of January 2016, Giulio Regeni, a 28-year-old Italian PhD student at Cambridge University, vanished from Cairo's Docky district, where he was researching independent trade unions among street vendors. 9 days later, on the 3rd of February, his body was found semi-naked in a shallow ditch beside the Cairo-Alexandria Desert Highway. The level of brutality recorded during the autopsy was simply staggering. Over 24 fractures, including 7 broken ribs, broken fingers, toes, stab wounds to the soles of his feet, likely from an ice pick or all, razor-inflicted cuts, cigarette burns across his body, a larger burn between his shoulder blades, a ruptured brain hemorrhage, and a fractured cervical vertebrae, which was deemed the likely cause of death. And if that wasn't horrifying enough at the surface level, a deeper forensic examination revealed the full extent of how he had likely suffered those wounds. Intermittent torture, anywhere from 10 to 14 hours at a time, for up to 7 days. And what would you know, those intervals of torment just so happen to line up with the known behaviors of Egypt's security services when they, interrogate people. Egyptian authorities, however, scrambled to rewrite history. Initial claims of his being hit by a car were quickly replaced with new explanations. First, he was mugged by common criminals, and then, when they had thought on it for a bit longer, no, he'd actually been mugged by a hardened band of criminals that specialized in impersonating police officers, and that was the answer they stuck with. Quite conveniently too, when they later supposedly tracked the gang down and moved in for the arrest, it just so happened to devolve into a shootout as they tried to get away in a van. One small problem with that explanation, however, is that multiple eyewitnesses to the incident attested to the fact that actually there was no shootout, and instead the gang were executed in cold blood and had their bodies moved into the van. It was also basically proven that the gang had basically no connection to Regeni at all, as Italian prosecutors, who naturally were taking quite the interest in the situation, started digging through phone records and found that the gang's supposed leader, one Tarek Abdel Fattah, was actually 60 miles north of Cairo on the day that Regeni disappeared. Add in the fact that in April 2016, multiple security insiders told Reuters that Regeni had been detained in plain clothes by Homeland Security of Egypt's police and transferred between multiple intelligence facilities within hours of his disappearance. And, well, yes, you don't exactly need a tinfoil hat to come to the conclusion that the Egyptian authorities were lying to cover up their own tracks, do you? The Italian authorities agreed with that assessment, and so they moved heaven and earth to find out exactly who was responsible, and now they believe they have those names. Major Magdi Ibrahim Abdullah Sharif, Major General Tariq Sabir, Colonel Athar Kamal Mohammed Ibrahim, and Colonel Uham Helmi, all of the Egyptian National Security Agency. Long story short, however, despite their all having been charged back in December 2020, a hell of a lot of legal flip-flopping has meant that seemingly the trial is still underway as of the time of writing. And we really should stress the word seemingly there, because in February 2024, there was a hell of a lot of reporting that it was meant to finally start, and then the reporting just kind of drops off a cliff, with there being only brief allusions to evidence getting submitted in May of that same year, and similarly scant mentions of there having been a hearing in January 2025, so we just don't know what the status of the case is at present with any sort of certainty. Number 29. The Rabaa Massacre. There are few events in Egypt's post-revolution history that illustrate the full brutality of its new regime quite so vividly as what happened in Rabaa El Adawiya Square on the 14th of August 2013. For the 6 weeks prior to that fateful date, supporters of the deposed President Mohamed Morsi had gathered there, men, women, and children alike, calling for his reinstatement after a military coup had swept him from power. It was peaceful, it was passionate, and it was tolerated, until it wasn't. Armored vehicles rolled in, bulldozers followed, snipers took up position, and then, without warning, the square was turned into a war zone. Security forces opened fire into the crowds, swept tent by tent, and by the day's end, hundreds, maybe even thousands lay dead. The government, for their part, claims that only 632 were killed, but Human Rights Watch and the National Alliance Supporting Legitimacy, a pro-Morsi political bloc in Egypt, both placed the toll far higher, with the former claiming a minimum of 904 killed and the latter claiming 2,600. Whatever the true number may be, however, there is no doubting that this incident alone stands as one of the bloodiest single-day massacres of demonstrators in modern history. In the immediate aftermath, the interim government didn't just double down, it slammed Egypt into full lockdown. A nationwide state of emergency was declared that same afternoon, suspending due process and stripping away the right to a fair trial, and a strict 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew was slapped onto more than half of the country's governorates, and the military vowed to enforce it with, quote, utmost firmness. Tourism hotspots like Sharm el-Sheikh were swiftly exempted. Can't have those economy-driving foreigners getting spooked after all, but for everyone else, daily life ground to a halt. Within days, the curfew had already begun to choke Cairo's economy, prompting the government to gradually reduce its hours in stages, though Fridays, the traditional day of protest, remained under full restriction for months. The emergency measures, which had originally been imposed for 30 days, were ultimately extended multiple times and only lifted 2 months later after a court ruling forced the government's hand. But by that point, the message had been sent loud and clear. The revolution was over, the counter-revolution was here, and anyone who stepped out of line would not be met with debate but with boots, bullets, and a blanket curfew. And you want to know the worst bit? While sure, the Egyptian government certainly doesn't want you to know about this, please don't think about it too much, just keep looking at the pyramids. No extensive effort in denial or covering up was even needed. This was a massacre easily in the same ballpark as that of Tiananmen Square, and the world just doesn't care. It's an event for which there is no real outrage, no real scorn, and barely a footprint in all the cultural zeitgeist. But at least you know now, so don't forget. Number 30. The Maspero Massacre. And for our final entry covering Egypt, unfortunately, it's another massacre. Another day when peaceful protest was met not with dialogue or reform, but with bullets, armored vehicles, and state-sanctioned violence. This time, though, it was the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces behind the violence, the military caretakers who had taken hold of the reins following Mubarak's fall in February 2011. The massacre itself happened on the 9th of October of that same year, when thousands of mostly Coptic Christian demonstrators were marching toward Cairo's state television building, the Maspero, to protest following the recent torching of a church far to the south in the city of Aswan, as well as follow-on comments from the local government leader Mustafa Kemal al-Sayed, who had first denied that the church even existed and then said that it didn't matter anyway because it had been illegally constructed. The plan when they got there was a simple one: a sit-in in front of the building and that's it. And while sure, they certainly didn't expect to receive a warm reception, and even that would be putting it mildly, none of them were ready for the wickedness that was to greet them. Live rounds dumped into the crowd, and 2 armored personnel carriers ramming that crowd. When the guns ran dry and the APCs withdrew, 24 people were dead and 212 were injured, many with irreparable, life-altering injuries. The state naturally was quick to gain control of the narrative, with state television even putting out a call for honorable citizens to go protect the military while the massacre was underway. And of course, once the official line had been agreed upon after some time had passed, those Christian protesters were armed, don't you know? They had started it. A blanket incitement that only spurred lynch mobs to attack Copts, further adding to the death toll. Unsurprisingly, the subsequent investigation was a farce. The Supreme Council of the Armed Forces refused any independent inquiry and assigned military prosecutors to examine the incident, effectively letting the army investigate itself. And while there have been plenty of further calls for justice, it doesn't exactly appear as if those calls are going to be answered anytime soon. Number 31. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And now it's time to move on to another nation, and let's stay in Egypt's neck of the woods and pop over to the other side of the Red Sea for a look at Saudi Arabia and its dirty secrets, beginning with the assassination of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. It happened on the 2nd of October 2018, when he walked into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, to retrieve documents needed for his upcoming marriage, and then he never left. At least, he never left alive or intact. Within the building, you see an 18-strong Saudi death squad, including intelligence agents, royal guards, among others, lay in wait. Audio recordings captured Khashoggi being strangled within minutes of entry, reportedly pleading that he couldn't breathe. His body was then dismembered using a bone saw operated by forensic Dr. Salah Mohammed Tabegi. To this day, his remains have not been found. It is typically believed that he may have been dissolved or smuggled out in diplomatic bags. We just don't know and likely never will. Riyadh's official narrative morphed dramatically over 3 weeks. Initially, Saudi authorities insisted he had left the consulate alive, a flat denial issued just 1 day after he entered. Then, by the 19th of October, with it having become blatantly apparent that that was not true, they shifted to saying that he had died during a fistfight gone wrong with people he encountered inside. And finally, on the 25th, in an admission that frankly took many totally by surprise, Saudi Arabia's Attorney General formally admitted the incident was a premeditated murder. But he emphasized, in the way that only a man with a muzzle pushed into his back ever could, that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, then the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia as he is now, had no direct knowledge or involvement. For his part, specifically, bin Salman acknowledged the killing occurred under my watch, accepting moral or political responsibility, but denied ordering it. And while ultimately we don't know with any full certainty whether or not he did, at least not with any currently available evidence, a later leak did reveal that Saud al-Qahtani, a senior royal court advisor and close aide to the Crown Prince, monitored the operation via Skype from Riyadh. During the call, he allegedly, according to Turkish and Arabic reporting, directed the operatives to bring me the head of the dog, a claim that, if nothing else, places the murder a whisker's width away from bin Salman. The murder, having been ordered by bin Salman personally, is also the opinion of the US intelligence services, as they, in an intelligence report declassified in 2021, stated with high confidence that the order had come from him, given his tight, direct control over the Saudi security services and the participation of his personal protection unit, the Rapid Intervention Force. Saudi Arabia, for its part, did bring some to justice for the killing, as in December 2019, a shadowy internal proceeding was started for 11 defendants, 5 of whom were sentenced to death, but later had their terms, in what was an awfully out-of-character display of mercy for the Saudi legal system, suspiciously so, some would say, commuted to life in prison. Amnesty International agreed on the suspiciousness of these sentences too, calling the trial a, quote, whitewash that has been closed to the public and to independent monitors, before adding further that, quoting again, the verdict fails to address the Saudi authorities' involvement. So, having said all of that then, what did the murder cost Saudi Arabia politically? Shock horror, we know, but in real terms, all. A few rich and powerful sorts cancelled their tickets to 2018's so-called Davos in the desert, basically just a big cocktail party for global elites, and that was about it. Oh, but the US Department of State during Joe Biden's tenure in 2021 did enact the so-called Khashoggi ban that barred 76 Saudi nationals, quote, believed to have been directly engaged in serious extraterritorial counter-dissident activities from coming to America, with bin Salman himself notably not being on that list. Real serious stuff there. We're sure that they all were really upset about that. And for all it's worth at this point, the ghost of Jamal Khashoggi does still remain. His fiancée, Hatice Sengiz, continues advocating for justice. His writings still resonate, and every time Saudi rulers talk of modernization, the memory of a dissident silenced in cold blood within their own consulate lingers as a stark reminder of the fact that for all that talk, in Saudi Arabia, dissent can cost you your life. Number 32, systemic migrant worker abuse. It's not, strictly speaking, an event per se, if we wish to be pedantic, as it's a long-lived and continual state of affairs, but it is something we want to discuss all the same, thanks to it really being something that Riyadh doesn't want shouted from the rooftops. As for what it is, that would be the systemic abuse of migrant workers. You see, Saudi Arabia is heavily dependent on foreign labor, with, as of 2024, 77% of its entire 17.2 million strong workforce being made up of migrant workers. And sure, some of them get to live it up big style, the wealthy Westerners who live in gated communities and the English teachers who get weirdly well compensated to teach young Saudis the international language of business and so on. But those sorts are very much in the minority, with the vast majority of that 77% rather tragically being comprised of workers from the developing world bound to the kafala sponsorship system. And why is this tragic, you might be thinking? Well, at its core, kafala is a legal framework that ties a migrant worker's right to live and work in the country directly to their employer, who acts as their sponsor. So far, so normal. I mean, it's not exactly uncommon to work somewhere and have your visa depend on it. Where it stops being normal, however, is when you learn that the kafala system allows the employer, not the state, to cancel the workers' visas at will and to deny them permission to change jobs, as well as, in many cases, even prevent them from leaving the country. Many will even have their passports confiscated outright by their employers, just in case they get any naughty ideas about saving up their reals and bolting for the airport. And for all of that, they have the sum total of zero legal recourse. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, reports from Human Rights Watch, Fair Square, and Amnesty International alike all repeatedly describe the kafala system as tantamount to modern slavery. And as much as you would wish such a thing were not possible, it does get worse, because when you give one human near total authority over another human, it doesn't exactly tend to bring out their soft and cuddly side. This is why abuses such as wage theft, excessive working hours of up to 80+ hours a week, hazardous living conditions, withheld medical care, and debt traps rooted in hefty recruitment fees are all widely reported. Worst of all, however, the system has also led to deaths. Lots of them, with most estimates being well into the tens of thousands, with many of them being ruled as natural, cardiac arrest, or other without investigation. In fact, one study of Nepali workers who died between 2019 and 2022 alone discovered that 65% of death certificates cited such vague causes to obscure the role of heat, overwork, and medical neglect. Human Rights Watch explicitly warns of electrocutions, falls, and even decapitations, all ever-present dangers thanks to lax safety procedures. It's worth pointing out, however, that efforts have been made to reform the system in recent years, as in March 2021, as part of its Vision 2030 initiative, Saudi Arabia rolled out a package of labor reforms aimed at curbing some of the most notorious aspects of the kafala system, with the changes including mandatory digital documentation of labor contracts and the removal of employer consent requirements for exit visas and job changes, provided these are requested after a contract ends or with appropriate notice. Groups like Amnesty International and the US Department of State remain skeptical, however, saying that the reforms have not actually dismantled the power imbalance baked into kafala and thus ultimately a moot, a claim they evidence by pointing out that since 2021, only 618 workers have reportedly secured a final exit permit without their sponsors' consent. Number 33. 9/11 connections. Remember 9/11? That horrific day back at the crack of the millennium that saw 2,977 people murdered in the single worst terrorist attack in history? You wouldn't be foolish for thinking that its perpetrators were Iraqi, Afghans, or maybe even Iranian, given the reaction of the United States. And indeed, for so long as such things were polled, so up until the turn of the 2010s or so, that is what the majority of Americans believed. And yet, no, not one of the hijackers was an Iraqi, an Afghan, or an Iranian. One was Lebanese, one was Egyptian, 2 were Emiratis, and 15 of them were Saudis. A fact that was nothing if not difficult for Riyadh. Let's be clear though, we, and indeed everyone, save for the most ardent of tinfoil hat enthusiasts, are not saying that Saudi Arabia ordered or orchestrated 9/11, as the evidence to even begin to speculate that they may have simply does not exist at all. But that's not to say that the kingdom's tidy little rogue actors excuse doesn't have a few leaks in it either, as what is known is that certain individuals linked to the Saudi state, powerful individuals, gave logistical, financial, and possibly even ideological support to the men who would kill nearly 3,000 people on that dark day. To start giving examples, let's rewind back to early on in the year 2000, when 2 of the future hijackers, Khalid al-Mindar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, landed in Los Angeles after attending an Al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia. Within weeks, they were being helped by a man named Ammar al-Bayoumi, a Saudi national living in San Diego, who they just happened to bump into, and who then helped them find an apartment, co-sign their lease, pay their rent, and help with day-to-day tasks like getting driver's licenses and opening bank accounts. Officially, al-Bayoumi was a student, but a 2022 FBI release suggests he was likely a Saudi intelligence operative, and also claimed further that there was, quote, a 50-50 chance that he had advanced knowledge of the 9/11 attacks. Then there was Fahad al-Thumairi, a Saudi consular official and hardline imam at the King Fahad Mosque in Los Angeles. According to FBI investigations, Thumairi met with al-Bayoumi and was allegedly one who told him to assist the hijackers. Witnesses say he referred to Hazmi and Midar as 2 very significant people, a description that seems more than a little odd for 2 guys who on paper were just recent passing acquaintances. For years, these links were buried in what became known as the 28 pages, a redacted section of the 2002 Congressional Joint Inquiry into 9/11. They were finally declassified in July 2016 and revealed a catalogue of troubling connections, recorded phone calls, financial transfers, and diplomatic links between the hijackers and Saudi officials in both Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. Like we say, not enough evidence to even begin speculating that Saudi Arabia itself orchestrated the attacks, but enough to absolutely say that some particularly big hats in the country certainly had a hand in it. And Saudi Arabia, for its part, maintained its line that its citizens involved in the attacks, be they in its execution or its planning, were just rogue actors, and vetoed any lawsuits being raised against it, until 2016 anyway, when Congress overrode President Obama to pass the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, which finally allowed US citizens to file suits against Saudi Arabia. Although, as of the time of writing, any kind of verdict is yet to be reached. Number 34. The execution of minors. There's no shortage of horror stories to be found in Saudi Arabia's justice system: public beheadings, lashings in the town square, and trials that are more ceremony than scrutiny. But among the most grotesque of them all is the kingdom's quiet, deliberate willingness to execute people for crimes they committed as children. It's been going on ever since the country's founding in 1932, and despite Riyadh's repeated pledges to reform, the killing of juvenile offenders remains a grim reality. A royal decree issued in April 2020 did proudly declare that, quote, no one in Saudi Arabia will be executed for a crime committed as a minor. But scratch beneath the surface and it does become painfully obvious that it wasn't quite the ban that it appeared to be. Take the case of Mustafa Hashim al-Darwish as an example. He was arrested in 2015 at the age of just 17, accused of attending anti-government protests in the country's Shia-majority eastern province. Despite the 2020 reforms and despite repeated appeals from rights groups citing his age at the time of the alleged crimes, he was executed in June 2021. The UN condemned the killing. Amnesty International accused the kingdom of breaking its own word. But Riyadh went ahead regardless. Al-Darwish isn't the only one either. Even after the global backlash that followed his execution, Saudi courts have continued to uphold death sentences for other young men arrested as children. Consider the group flagged by Amnesty International in 2022. 7 young Shia men, some reportedly still in school, were arrested, with one being as young as 12. Their crimes? attending protests, chanting slogans, participating in funeral processions, and that is it. They were tried in the kingdom's notorious specialized criminal court, ostensibly designed to handle terrorism cases, but frequently used instead to process political dissent, especially from the Shia minority. In 2023, Amnesty reported that these young men's death sentences had been formally upheld and that their executions were now considered imminent. After pulling both English and Arabic news sites apart, however, we remain uncertain if they actually were. So while Saudi Arabia insists it's reformed, the evidence kinda suggests otherwise. At best, the 2020 decree was a half measure, riddled with loopholes. At worst, it was a PR stunt meant to deflect international scrutiny. Because when it comes to children and the death penalty in Saudi Arabia, the killing, seemingly, hasn't stopped. Number 35. The suppression of Shia minorities. For our final Saudi entry, let's examine a facet of the kingdom that it definitely doesn't shout from the rooftops: the systematic suppression of its Shia Muslim minority. You see, approximately 10 to 15% of Saudi Arabia's population is Shia, with them largely being concentrated in the oil-rich eastern province. And for decades, these communities have faced discrimination at best and violent repression at worst. The Saudi government, dominated by Sunnis, has long treated Shia citizens with suspicion, branding them as potential Iranian proxies or troublemakers rather than as equal Saudis. And so, a pattern emerged. When Shia have dared to demand basic rights or voice dissent, the state's response has been fierce and merciless, yet cloaked by silence. During the Arab Spring in 2011, for example, while uprisings grabbed headlines in Tunisia, Egypt, and Bahrain, a quieter revolt started in Saudi's eastern province. In towns like Katyn and Al-Awima, protesters took to the streets calling for reforms, an end to anti-Shia bias, release of political prisoners, and more representation. The Saudi state, for its part, answered with bullets and arrests. Over the ensuing years, dozens of Shia protesters, many of them just youths, were killed in clashes or forcibly disappeared. One of the most emblematic figures was Sheikh Namir al-Namir, a fiery Shia cleric who spoke out against oppression. He became a leading voice of the protests until Saudi security forces shot and arrested him in 2012. After a blatantly unfair trial based largely on his sermons, Sheikh Namir was executed by beheading in January 2016 alongside 46 others in a mass execution that Saudi authorities claimed was for terrorism. The message was clear. Any challenge from the Shia minority would be crushed, and even a religious leader was not off limits. The crackdown didn't stop there either. Entire neighborhoods in Shia towns have been laid siege to by the military. In 2017, to give an example, armored vehicles rolled into Al-Awamiyah to quash militants and protesters, and in the process, historic quarters were reduced to rubble, 20,000 residents were forced to flee, and as many as 25 people might have been killed. The government's narrative, of course, was that it was conducting a security operation against terrorists, a label that is often broadly slapped on outspoken Shia. Meanwhile, Shia pilgrims and clerics regularly report harassment, be it restrictions on their building of mosques, long passages in school textbooks disparaging their beliefs as heresy, or employment discrimination that keep the top rungs of civil service all but totally closed off to them. Saudi officials rarely acknowledge this sectarian repression. They try to make sure it all happens away from the international cameras, and when pressed, they'll point to Salman bin Abdulaziz Al Saud's, the King of Saudi Arabia's 2018 decree that full citizenship was to be extended equally and that all sects of Islam were to be equally respected before the law, as proof that such times are in the past. Grim episodes that leak out, however, reveal a different reality. One of these is the mass trial and subsequent execution of 14 Shia men from Katyn in 2019, all of them convicted of protest-related offenses and believed to have been convicted upon dubious evidence and tortured into confession. Do you think they feel like they were particularly respected? Ultimately, Saudi Arabia would far rather you focus on its grand visions of modernization, but the bloodstains in Katyn's streets and the unmarked graves of disappeared Shia activists, well, they force you to focus on the truth, that it effectively has a sectarian underclass. Number 36. The Rape of Nanjing. On to Japan now. Yes, Japan, the land of lining up to board trains, saying itadakimasu before eating, and public conveniences that emit the sound of running water to mask the squeezing out of a big fat dump. It isn't exactly the first nation that comes to mind when one thinks of barbarism, certainly, but turn the clock back 80 years, and well, let's just say that Japan, then in the throngs of its expansionist imperial age, was just a little bit different. And by a little bit different, we mean possibly one of the most wicked nations nations to ever exist. It is a history that the modern Japanese government has a bit of a complicated relationship with, to say the least, and that's no better exemplified than the atrocity that was the rape of Nanjing. It began on the 13th of December 1937 when Imperial Japanese troops captured the Chinese capital, Nanjing, during the then nascent Second Sino-Japanese War. What followed, however, wasn't a mere occupation and the expectant acts of repression, but pure, abject, unadulterated slaughter, as over the course of 6 long weeks, the Japanese occupiers unleashed a half-calculated campaign, half-out-of-control monster of mass murder, torture, and sexual violence that still defies comprehension even to this day. By the time the killing finally stopped, as many as 340,000 people were dead, shot, burned, beheaded, bayoneted, dismembered, or buried alive. And further still, upwards of 80,000 women had been raped, with sources discussing girls from as young as 7 through to women as old as 70, all falling victim. From the start, a few Westerners in Nanjing, like German businessman John Rabe and American missionary Minnie Vautrin, kept diaries of the atrocities as they desperately worked to keep civilians safe in a self-declared safety zone, one whose only real protection came from a want on Japan's part to avoid diplomatic incident with nations whose passports they waved about in lieu of rifles. They were right to be keeping such records too, because the modern Japanese government often has trouble contending with the actions of its imperial forerunners, and here's some examples. In May 1994, Justice Minister Shigeto Nagano provoked outrage by calling the massacre a fabrication. He claimed the mass killings never happened, a statement so blatantly false that it cost him his cabinet post. He had to resign after China and other nations protested his bald-faced denial of very well-documented crimes against humanity. In 2001, a new right-wing Japanese history textbook backed by the Society for History Textbook Reform downplayed Japan's wartime aggression and barely mentioned Nanjing at all. This revisionist book, approved by the government screening process, described the Nanjing atrocities in vague, sanitized terms, or just not at all. Its publication sparked fury in China, which accused Japan of whitewashing the mass murder of its civilians. In February 2012, Takashi Kuwamura, the mayor of Nagoya, told a visiting delegation from Nanjing that he believed there was no massacre of innocent people in 1937, only the usual combat of war. Nanjing then froze its sister city ties with Nagoya in protest, but Kawamura refused to retract his remarks. In November of that same year, former Tokyo governor Shintaro Ishihara, a prominent nationalist, claimed that the Nanjing massacre was a lie concocted by the Chinese. In a press conference, he sneered, "Show me concrete evidence that the Imperial Army killed 400,000 people. It was the Chinese who killed Chinese." Ishihara's incendiary denial, blaming the victims, did not exactly do wonders for already strained China-Japan relations. Then, in February 2014, Naoki Hyakuta, an influential governor on Japan's public broadcaster NHK, an ally of the then Prime Minister Abe, declared that the Nanjing massacre never happened. In a speech, he claimed it was all made up. He said that such ugly stories shouldn't be taught to children. The Japanese government, when pressed, defended Hyakuta as speaking in a personal capacity, effectively condoning this brazen historical negation. Chinese officials condemned the comments as an outrageous affront to historical truth. So you can probably see what we mean. The Nanjing massacre, bit of a touchy subject for the Japanese government, but that happened. It was fucking horrible. Number 37. The comfort women. And a similarly touchy subject for the Japanese government is that of the comfort women, the euphemism for the Imperial Japanese military system of forced wartime brothels. All in all, up to 200,000 women and girls, mostly Korean but also Chinese, Filipino, and Dutch, were coerced, deceived, or forcibly taken into sexual slavery from the early 1930s through to 1945. Many were promised jobs only to be shipped to remote camps. Some were rounded up at gunpoint. Once there, they endured systematic, often daily gang rape by soldiers, horrendous hygienic neglect, forced abortions, and terrifying medical inspections, not for their own health, mind you, but instead to ensure the brothels ran without disease spreading to the men. Survivors describe being treated like public toilets, trapped as disposable comfort tools until illness, pregnancy, or death intervened. The system was no accidental failure. It was engineered by the state to control and exploit women, rationalized as a logistics measure, and maintained with military oversight. It remains one of the most chilling examples of institutionalized sexual violence in all of human history. And as for it being a touchy subject in Tokyo today, here's some examples. After the war, the Japanese government refused outright to acknowledge the comfort women system. Victims were shamed into silence, and official denial lasted until 1993, when Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono publicly admitted the Imperial Japanese Army was involved and that many women were coerced, offering an apology and expressing remorse. Come 2007, that tone had changed, however, as then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared there was no evidence of forced recruitment by the Japanese military, minimizing the state's role and declaring coercion an unproven assertion. At the same time, Education Minister Nariaki Nakayama was pushing to remove references to comfort women from school textbooks, an effort that was successful because revised textbooks approved in 2005 to 2007 either softened or omitted the system entirely. In 2015, however, a final agreement was reached between South Korea and Japan in which Abe offered a formal apology and a 1 billion yen fund for the victims. But yet, despite this supposedly being a final agreement, Abe insisted the fund was established out of sympathy, not out of legal responsibility. And even as recently as 2022, 14 school textbooks had the words forced arrest and forced conscription replaced with mobilization and conscription, respectively. Number 38. Unit 731. And here's another one Tokyo avoids mentioning. Unit 731, Imperial Japan's secret germ warfare unit. Established around Harbin in occupied Manchuria in the 1930s, by the war's end, it had become an epicenter of medical horror. Thousands of people, Chinese civilians, Soviet and Allied POWs, babies, and the elderly alike, all of them were dehumanized as maruta, or logs, and deliberately infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, or typhoid, then vivisected alive, often without anesthesia, exposed to frostbite, amputated and reattached, or tied to stakes and bombed to test weapons. The experiments were neither rogue nor chaotic either. They were run by army doctors under military command, overseen by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, with full government backing. When defeat loomed, staff executed remaining prisoners, destroyed records, and blew up the compounds in an attempt to cover their tracks. But worse still, the US and the Soviets alike helped to cover it up, with both of them offering either blanket immunity or mere show trials in the way of consequences, all so that they could get their hands on the precious expertise that was honed in the house of horrors that was Unit 731. With time, however, the truth did start to leak out. Documents were declassified and survivors started to speak their truth to the media. But Tokyo, in response, still refuses to fully confront the reality of the matter. For example, for decades afterwards, the official Japanese line was that Unit 731 had been a rumor, wartime propaganda at best. When survivors and journalists started digging in the 1980s, officials either shrugged or said there was no evidence anything bad had happened at all. And even when the Ministry of Education was dragged into court in the 1990s for censoring schoolbooks that dared mention germ warfare and vivisections, they stood their ground. Japan's Supreme Court later ruled that textbooks didn't have to include Unit 731, and many still don't. It wasn't until 2002 that a Japanese court reluctantly acknowledged that Unit 731 had used humans for lethal experimentation. But even then, it refused to grant compensation or issue an apology, saying treaties had settled everything. Apparently, the job was done, the case was closed. Ultimately, Japan has never issued an apology specifically for Unit 731. War apology statements discuss other acts of Imperial Japanese cruelty or refer to suffering broadly without acknowledging human experimentation or biological weapons, leaving these specific crimes unaddressed. And given that we're 80 years removed from when it all came crumbling down, probably close to the day, in fact, by the time this goes live, what would an apology or effort to make it right even look like at this point anyway? Nearly all the surviving victims have already passed. Number 39, the Bataan Death March. Our next Japanese entry occurred in April 1942 on the Bataan Peninsula of the Philippines. There, after months of brutal siege, some 76,000 American and Filipino troops had just surrendered to the advancing Japanese in the single largest capitulation in US military history. And their reward for dropping their rifles? A 65-mile forced march through blistering tropical heat, terminable starvation, and cruelty so extreme that to this very day, the mere name Bataan remains synonymous with atrocity. The prisoners were already gaunt from hunger and disease, thanks to months of fighting with supply lines stretched to breaking point, and the Japanese provided them with almost no food or water. The men who understandably collapsed? while they were bayoneted, beaten, or simply just shot as the column marched evermore. The men who tried to hastily sip from roadside puddles, decapitated. The men who complained, forced to dig their own graves and then buried alive. If they wanted to teach you a lesson, but not kill you, well, what you got was called sun treatment, being herded into an open-air pen and left uncovered in the blazing sun for hours. By the time the column reached their destination of Camp O'Donnell, thousands were dead, maybe as many as 18,650. The rest, they arrived as living skeletons, only alive in the most abstract sense of the word. Why do this? Well, two reasons. One was ideology. In the Imperial Japanese military mindset, surrender was cowardice. These prisoners, therefore, were beneath contempt, unworthy of mercy. And two, logistics. The Japanese weren't prepared to handle 76,000 captives and had no plan for food, water, or transport. And so they walked, the vast overwhelming bulk of the supplies that were available being used to keep the captors alive rather than the prisoners. When the war ended in 1945, however, there was at least a sliver of justice. General Masaharu Homma, the Japanese commander in the Philippines, was tried by a US military tribunal and executed for failing to stop the atrocities. A few others were prosecuted too. But in Japan itself, the whole episode barely made a dent in the public consciousness. During the war itself, the Japanese public had only heard of a great victory in the Philippines. And afterwards, well, the popular histories, and indeed the government too, simply didn't shout about it at all. In fact, it wouldn't be until 2009, 67 years later, that a Japanese official finally addressed the march, when Japan's then ambassador to the US, Ichiro Fujisaki, offered a heartfelt apology for the tremendous damage and suffering to 73 surviving veterans of the march. However, it is also notable that is about all that Tokyo was willing to give in that regard, as to this day, not a single emperor or prime minister has mentioned Bataan in an official apology. Number 40. The Manila Massacre. And for our final Japanese entry, we remain in the Philippines, but head to the capital of Manila. There, in early 1945, with the war now approaching its conclusion and with Japan clearly not going to be on the winning side, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of the Japanese occupying garrison, had ordered a full retreat out of Manila to make for more defensible ground, better suited to a final stand. That order, however, was completely ignored by Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, who decided that the 10,000 Marines under his command were going to stay put and kill. And so it was that for the next month, the 3rd of February to the 3rd of March to be precise, Manila was turned into a smoldering hell. At St. Paul's College, dozens of nuns, schoolgirls and refugees were raped for hours before being bayoneted to death. At a Red Cross hospital, bedridden patients were murdered and medical staff mutilated. Babies were flung into the air and speared on bayonets. Women were raped in front of their husbands. Entire blocks were doused in gasoline and set alight, with their occupants still inside. By the end, at least 100,000 civilians were dead, but some scholars do place the death toll at nearer to 500,000, all of them killed not en masse with an atomic weapon, not with vast fleets of advanced aircraft high above the earth, but one at a time, close enough to look them in the eye. And the worst bit, it appears that the Manila Massacre has simply been forgotten about, giving Tokyo the freedom to just totally ignore it. We do stress the word appears there, because despite finding online references to an apology that was given for the Manila Massacre back in 2012, we pulled English, Japanese, and Tagalog news sites apart and just couldn't find a single trace of that at all, never mind actually concrete confirmation that one was ever delivered. Why this is the case? We've got no idea. The potential death toll alone easily places the Manila Massacre as among, if not the single worst act that Imperial Japan ever committed, at least from a quantitative metric. If anything, you'd think that Manila, as opposed to Nanjing, would be the one that the popular zeitgeist did remember, with it hailing from World War II rather than the earlier Second Sino-Japanese War. Whatever the reason, as much as it looks like Tokyo managed to skirt having to address the Manila Massacre at all, given what we've seen in our other 4 Japanese entries, we feel pretty safe in chalking it up as something that probably, rather, you didn't know about. Number 41. The Armenian Genocide. And for our final 10 entries today, we're going to abandon the clusters of 5 structure that we've used thus far and cast our net wider, because there's no monopoly on horror, and as a result we find ourselves spoiled for choice for what to include in a video like this. which isn't really a good thing, is it? So, let's start strong, shall we, with one of the most fiercely denied genocides in modern history, that of the Armenians at the hands of the then collapsing Ottoman Empire. It began in 1915 with what the Ottoman Empire called the relocation of the Armenian population from their indigenous lands in the eastern Anatolian provinces like Van, Erzurum, Bitlis, and Diyarbakir to southern provinces and the Syrian desert. What was dubbed mere relocation, however, to get the Christian Armenians away from the Russian front, because solidarity under Christ and all that, was actually their state-organized mass deportation and genocide implemented under the temporary law of deportation, the so-called Tassir Law. For the settlements that now stood deserted as Armenians continued to be rounded up, the Ottoman government decided their future by passing the law on abandoned property in September 1915. Outwardly, this was a general law, one that allowed them to seize homes, livestock, land, and valuables for the greater public good if they happened to find themselves abandoned. But in reality, it was only ever applied in one way, onto the ethnic group whose property that the state themselves had forced to become abandoned. And as for what happened after the deportations, those who had survived the arduous and brutal journey were herded into desert death camps, like those at Ras Al Ain, where up to 80,000 Armenians were systematically butchered, with 300 to 500 deportees being executed daily via mass shootings alone. Other survivors were raped, tortured, or poisoned. The government's response to that unmitigated horror, you ask? A total blackout. The Ottomans banned photographs, they censored foreign reports, they had their relocation cover, and they were going to stick with it come hell or high water. And when the Ottoman Empire's core territory of Anatolia, as well as that little sliver in continental Europe, became the Republic of Turkey that we know today, Ankara doubled down on denial. Successive Turkish governments have refused to recognize the killings as genocide, claiming instead that Armenians died in civil conflict or disease. They've spent decades funding denial lobbyists, passing laws that criminalize genocide recognition, and authoring schoolbooks that omit or distort the facts. Even President Erdogan labeled the deportations, quote, the most reasonable action that could be taken in such a period on a April 2019 Twitter post. But the facts are clear. There's mountains of testimony. There's photographs that slip through. There's German attachés who watched it unfold. There's the telegrams ordering the deaths, the bones, thousands still being found to this day. All of it is evidence for one simple fact. The Armenian genocide happened. Whatever Ankara has to say on the matter, be damned. Number 42, Indonesia's anti-communist purge. To Indonesia now, because from 1965 through 1966, its military embarked on one of the 20th century's deadliest witch hunts, one in which they targeted anyone they suspected of being a communist. It all only lasted a few months, but when all was said and done and the guns fell silent, at least 500,000 people, and maybe as many as 1 million, lay dead. Men were dragged from their homes and executed in mass shootings. Women were raped, tortured, or hacked down in rice fields. Entire families were slaughtered based on rumors or guilt by association. Death squads comprising army units led by Major General Suharto, paramilitaries, and local vigilantes roamed villages in Central and East Java, North Sumatra, and Bali, dumping bodies into rivers and mass graves. There was tragically an ethnic component to it too. You see, thanks to geography, Indonesia had quite the sizable Chinese minority, and given the ascension of Mao back in the old country, paranoia started to abound that any day now they would rise up in unison and descend upon Jakarta. Little red books are waving. A paranoia that completely overlooked the fact that the vast majority of Indonesia's Chinese population settled not during Mao's era, not even during Chiang Kai-shek's era. No. In fact, they'd been there since China was still ruled by a bloody emperor. So yeah, such concerns kinda scapegoating. Then came the inevitable cover-up, which proved every bit as efficient as the killings. For more than 50 years, Indonesians were fed an official narrative that the massacres were a heroic purge of traitors who wished to stage a communist coup. The army's systematic butchery was recast as spontaneous, righteous vengeance by ordinary citizens, and school history books depicted the victims as cruel villains who got what they deserved. And speaking otherwise, strictly taboo. Under Suharto, who later became president in 1967, discussing the mass graves could earn you a spot in one. An entire generation grew up in enforced amnesia, the victims unmentioned, the perpetrators swaggering around as national saviors. It wasn't until the year 2000, ultimately, so long after Suharto fell, that President Abdurrahman Wahid became the first to express some regret, and so slow moves began to be made towards earning absolution for the state's sins. Such moves, however, have ultimately been lacking, to put it mildly. In 2012, for example, the National Commission on Human Rights urged a formal apology and prosecutions as soon as possible, while some of the perpetrators were still alive to bag, although ultimately nothing came of that. Then in 2023, President Jokowi acknowledged, quote, gross human rights violations, but stopped short of an apology. And as for the prosecutions, ultimately, no, that didn't happen, and given the age of the perpetrators at this point, unless something big happens in Indonesian politics, they tragically are unlikely to ever occur. Number 43. Argentina's Dirty War. Between 1976 and 1983, Argentina's military dictatorship embarked on a campaign of systematic terror, a so-called dirty war that saw tens of thousands of its own citizens abducted, tortured, and executed in secret. Much like how we just saw in Indonesia, it happened under the guise of rooting out leftist subversives, with the junta targeting students, union organizers, academics, or even just those who seemed suspicious, i.e., in reality, anyone whose naughty ideas, proven or not, might threaten the regime's stability. When rounded up, they were sent to clandestine detention centers across the country, often repurposed schools or warehouses, where they were subjected to beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding, forcible drugging, and some were just straight up killed. The worst fate of all, however, that would be finding yourself with a seat on a plane, because if that happened, death didn't come for you after landing, it came for you mid-flight in the depths of the Rio de la Plata or the South Atlantic, after the door was popped and you were thrown out. Ultimately, we don't know how many people met that truly horrible fate. We likely never will. More broadly, the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, set up to explore exactly what you would imagine from its name after the fall of the junta in 1983, believes that 8,961 people are missing and unaccounted for from that period, with Amnesty International citing a higher figure of around 20,000. But others, most famously the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, an Argentine human rights association formed during the closing days of the junta, believe it's closer to 30,000. And they would know they are the women who, even as the terror still raged, began silently marching through Buenos Aires with signs, photos, white scarves, demanding to know what happened to their sons and daughters. The government, of course, denied everything. They are neither dead nor alive. They're missing, General Videla infamously said. It was a line that became grotesquely emblematic of the regime's gaslighting tactics, a state that vanished people by the thousand and then simply denied it. Shockingly, however, the coming of democracy to Argentina would not bring justice either, as in 1986 and 1987, the newly elected government, under vast pressure from the still powerful military, passed the full stop and due obedience laws which halted prosecutions and handed out blanket amnesty to many of those involved. As a result, for years, the truth was suppressed under the weight of legal barriers and institutional silence. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the tide finally began to turn. The amnesty laws were repealed and trials resumed. For many, however, those 2 decades of reprieve were all the time they needed to escape justice. For example, Admiral Jorge Anaya, one of the 3 heads of the final ruling junta, who was briefly arrested but ultimately died while under comfortable house arrest in 2008 without ever setting foot in a proper prison. General Basilio Lamy Dozo, head of the Air Force during the regime, he was tried, sentenced, and then pardoned by President Menem in 1990. He went on to live the rest of his life in freedom and died peacefully in 2017. Interior Minister Albano Hagendagai, a key architect of the terror, he too was pardoned and spent his final years under house arrest, dying in 2012 having never served a real sentence. Hector Febres, a notorious Navy torturer at a detention center, he conveniently died of cyanide poisoning in 2007, just days before his verdict was due. Rodolfo Almiron, a police chief turned death squad leader, he fled to Spain, was finally arrested in 2006, but then suffered a stroke that left him unfit to stand trial. He died in hospital in 2009, having never been convicted. Number 44. Mexico's Tlatelolco Massacre. On the night of the 2nd of October 1968, just 10 days before Mexico City hosted the Olympic opening ceremonies, the Mexican government carried out a massacre of student protesters in the Plaza de Tlatelolco. As army units and plainclothes snipers opened fire, unarmed demonstrators, many of them mere teens, ran for their lives or fell. The next morning, the government made all that blood simply disappear. Bodies were hastily trucked away and bullet holes were plastered over, and thus began one of the most brazen cover-ups in Mexican history. Officially, only around 25 people died that night, a figure which was repeated by much of Mexico's media, with the country's news outlets being only too happy to don a pair of blinkers if it meant the government would stay off their backs and allow them to keep flogging papers and selling advertising spaces. The government's excuse for it all? That students had fired first, forcing soldiers to defend themselves. It was a scripted lie from top to bottom. In truth, documents declassified decades later showed that government agents had deployed snipers to incite chaos and justify the slaughter. For years, however, the Mexican authorities stuck to their line and ensured a broader, ironclad silence to stop the truth from ever leaking out. Archives were locked away. Investigation was nil. But the families of the victims, they knew the truth, and thus found themselves trapped in an agonizing limbo, constantly bombarded by state messaging that chastised and decried their slain loved ones as mere fugitives and troublemakers. The whole while they knew the truth, that they were the victims of unprovoked murder, plain and simple. In 2000, however, the political ground shifted. After 70 years of uninterrupted institutional revolutionary party rule, opposition candidate Vicente Fox took the presidency, and with him came promises to finally confront the ghosts of Mexico's past. He created a special prosecutor for social and political movements of the past, tasked with dragging events like this one into the light. For the families, it felt like the first crack in the wall of silence. Long story short, though, despite plenty of attempts, including among which was the arrest and detention of Luis Echeverria, Secretary of the Interior during the massacre and later president, under genocide charges for the massacre, justice ultimately proved fleeting, with him having the charges dropped outright in 2009. In the end, all Mexico was really given was a 2018 recognition of the massacre as a state crime and an official apology from President Claudia Sheinbaum in 2024. Number 45. The Bangladesh Genocide. In 1971, Pakistan launched one of the most calculated genocides of the 20th century. Over the course of just 9 months, its military and aligned militias carried out a state-directed campaign of mass murder, ethnic cleansing, and sexual violence in East Pakistan, known today as Bangladesh. It began on the night of the 25th of March under the name Operation Searchlight. The plan was simple: decapitate the Bengali nationalist movement before it could declare independence. The methods, however, were nothing short of barbaric. Troops landed in Dhaka, sealed the city, and went straight for the intellectual class. Hundreds were executed at Dhaka University, professors shot in their offices, students bayoneted in their dorms, journalists and doctors dragged from their homes and shot in the streets. In the Shinkari Bazaar neighborhood alone, over 200 Hindu civilians were killed in just a single night. And this was just the beginning. Over the coming weeks and months, the violence spread. Town after town was purged. Hindu villages were torched. Women, both Muslim and Hindu, were rounded up and subjected to systematic rape, often in camps established solely for that purpose. Some were raped in front of their families. Others were raped until they died. The Pakistani army treated it as a tool of war, a method of humiliation and domination. All told, an estimated 200 to 400,000 women were raped. By the time the war ended in December, the death toll stood somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million people, depending on who you ask. The Pakistani government surprisingly still insists that it was less than 30,000, but to Bangladesh, the real number doesn't matter so much as the scale of the horror, because almost every family lost someone and every survivor saw something they'll never forget. And then there was the final act of cruelty. In the dying days of the war, as defeat loomed, the Pakistani army, aided by local Islamist paramilitaries like al-Badr, abducted more than 200 of the country's brightest minds, professors, poets, doctors, engineers. They were blindfolded, executed, and dumped in mass graves. It was a deliberate attempt to cripple the brain of a future nation. In the chaos of it all, 10 million people fled into India. Countless others were displaced internally. Homes, temples, and schools were left in ruins. But Bangladesh was born drenched in blood and trauma. And what of Pakistan? It never apologized, never held its generals to account. The genocide is absent from its school books, ignored by its officials, and denied even to this day. But denial changes nothing, because the ghosts of 1971 still walk the streets of Dhaka, and they're not silent. Number 46, the Hamar Massacre. To Syria now, where in February of 1982, President Hafez al-Assad decided the bell was to toll for a then 6-year-long Muslim Brotherhood-led uprising in the town of Hama. His solution, however, was nothing short of wanton barbarism, with it rapidly devolving into a full massacre of local Sunni Muslims. For 27 days, the Syrian army and the paramilitary defense companies, under the command of Assad's ruthless brother Rifat al-Assad, laid siege to the town. They used heavy artillery, BM-21 rockets, tank barrages, and aerial bombardment to reduce the city to rubble. And we mean that literally, as here is Hama before the siege, and here is Hama afterward. Entire neighborhoods, including the historic Old Quarter, were leveled, with any structure that did remain finding itself as naught but an obelisk to the depraved lengths that al-Assad would go to maintain his power, with 2/3 of the town being destroyed in all. The regime also cut off electricity, communications, and food supplies, leaving civilians trapped and starving. As the bombardment subsided, ground troops poured into the ruined streets. Soldiers conducted door-to-door sweeps, dragging men and boys from their homes, summarily executing them in public squares or dumping them into mass graves. Witnesses spoke of civilians with their fingernails ripped out, mosque floors littered with corpses, and pregnant women forced into the streets. Rafat himself later boasted that his forces killed around 38,000 people, figures that align with independent estimates ranging from 10,000 to 40,000 deaths among all civilians. This death toll, without doubt, makes the Hama massacre the single deadliest massacre perpetrated by an Arab government against its own people in modern Middle Eastern history, the sheer scale for a single incident being something that even ISIS wouldn't be able to top during their time in control of most of Syria. As for the Assad regime's response, the city was to be sealed off and survivors were to be silenced. As far as Damascus was concerned, no one was to speak of it ever again, something that was achieved for the best part of 4 decades. Anyone who even mentioned those weeks could face torture or disappearance, and state media offered nothing more than a cursory statement about crushing armed gangs, then fell entirely silent on the matter. Within Syria more broadly, families whose loved ones had vanished lived in a terrifying quiet. As one witness put it, when his body was returned to the family, his eyes and fingernails were missing. The regime's chokehold on memory was absolute too. Large swaths of Hama, for example, were rebuilt over mass graves to erase the material evidence, and in fact, still to this day, we don't even know the full impact that the siege had on the town's literally ancient water lifts. Were they damaged and rebuilt? Were they spared from destruction? The story varies. Ultimately, it was only with the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, which began to loosen people's fears, that survivors began to speak openly, with Khaled Al-Khani, a local artist, recounting that, quote, "The fact that Syrians will commemorate the killings of their loved ones for the first time in 30 years evokes in me strange feelings. It is not a celebration, but it cannot be mourned like a funeral," end quote. Number 47, the Rohingya genocide. In August 2017, Myanmar's military launched what they vaguely termed clearance operations in Rakhine State. The target was the Rohingya, a Muslim minority long denied citizenship, rights, and recognition. And what followed was a campaign of destruction so thorough, so brutal, that the United Nations would later call it a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Villages were reduced to cinders, civilians were slaughtered, survivors ran for their lives. Within weeks, more than 700,000 people had crossed the border into Bangladesh, dazed, wounded, broken. The operation began on the 25th under the pretext of responding to militant attacks. Soldiers, border police, and local militias moved in with devastating precision, and entire communities were surrounded, set alight, and wiped out. In the village of Tulatoli, to zoom in for a specific example, troops gathered civilians by the riverbank, separated the men from the women, and then opened fire. Those who survived the bullets were burned alive. In Indin, for another example, 10 Rohingya men were photographed kneeling before they were executed and buried in a shallow grave. These were not rogue units. This was not a mere security situation that spiraled out of control. This was policy right from the very top, and that policy bore destruction that almost defies comprehension. Satellite imagery alone showed hundreds of villages obliterated. Witnesses spoke of babies thrown into flames, of children shot while clinging to their parents, of thousands of women and girls being raped. The response from Myanmar's authorities was denial, unwavering, cynical, and absolute. The army insisted it had acted lawfully against terrorists. State media dismissed survivor testimony and photographic evidence as fake. Officials claimed the Rohingya had burned their own homes to frame the military. In the regime's narrative, these people were not victims. they were not even civilians. They were illegal Bengalis who had no right to be there in the first place. The truth, however, did find its way to the surface, and of course the state came down upon it like a ton of bricks. Take Wallone and Kwai So Do. They were both journalists for Reuters working on exposing the Indian massacre, and they were given years behind bars for their reporting, ostensibly for violating the Official Secrets Act. Meanwhile, Myanmar's then de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi, once a symbol of resistance and democracy, stood before the International Court of Justice and denied flagrantly that a genocide had taken place. And then, with international pressure piling up, her government sent bulldozers into Rakhine to start clearing the evidence, leveling whole villages and leaving only military installations and commercial farmland where communities once stood. Today, nearly 1 million Rohingya live in exile in Bangladesh, confined to sprawling refugee camps with no clear future and no way back home. Around 600,000 further remain in Myanmar, stripped of citizenship, movement, and rights. They live under what human rights groups describe as a system of apartheid, segregated, surveyed, and silenced. That, of course, makes Rohingya genocide an ongoing situation, one that to this day is believed to have claimed perhaps as many as 43,000 lives. Number 48, the Paris massacre. On the 17th of October 1961, at the height of the Algerian War of Independence against France, around 30,000 Algerian men, women, and children gathered in Paris to protest a discriminatory nighttime curfew imposed solely on Algerian Muslim workers, French Muslims, and French Muslims of Algeria. Organized by the Paris branch of the National Liberation Front, an Algerian political party, the demonstration was intended to be peaceful, but swiftly became fatal. It all began when, acting under orders from Maurice Papon, the prefect of police, along with approval from Interior Minister Roger Frey and Prime Minister Michel Debré, the police launched a brutal crackdown and intercepted the protest with riot shields, tear gas, clubs, rifle butts, mass arrests, and most shockingly of all, live ammunition. Estimates of the death toll remain contested. The French government officially admitted to 40 deaths in 1998, while historians, most notably Jean-Luc Inoudy, argue that between 120 and 200, or maybe even as many as 300 Algerians may have been killed, many beaten or thrown into the Seine River. In 1999, a prosecutor's report confirmed 48 drownings on a single night, plus 142 additional deaths in detention or shortly thereafter, acknowledging that at the very least, the real death toll was far higher than that which had originally been proclaimed. And further, around 11,000 to 12,000 Algerians were arrested, not just for protesting, but often simply for their appearance, with many being sent to internment centers like the Parc des Expulsions and the Velodrome d'Hiver. Survivors described beatings, overcrowding, lack of food, and dehumanizing conditions. For decades, French authorities suppressed discussion of and underplayed the massacre. Press coverage initially referred only to a minor clash, and police cleanup teams removed bodies from the Seine, scrubbed the pavement by dawn, and detained survivors in silence. It wasn't until the late 80s, ultimately, that historians began properly investigating the events, and with their work, public awareness and outrage alike began to grow too, leading to the first public commemoration on the 17th of October 1991, 30 years after the fact. The state holding its hands up, however, had to take even longer, until 2012, in fact, when President François Hollande finally formally acknowledged that Algerians were killed in a police crackdown. This in turn was followed by President Emmanuel Macron describing the massacre as inexcusable in 2021 and a 2024 National Assembly binding resolution condemning the massacre as bloody and murderous. But what of actual acts of absolution? Compensation, arrests, things like that? Because sure, apologies are great and they are absolutely owed, but they don't actually achieve much, do they? Well, Papon did find himself prosecuted for crimes against humanity, but not the Paris massacre specifically. No, instead it was for his role in the deportation of France's Jewish population during the Nazi occupation. He died in 2007, having never had a chance to atone for the massacre. And neither were there any prosecutions of the low-level grunts who actually carried it out either. The French government has never publicly commented on why this is the case, at least that we were able to find, but there are those who argue that the 1962, 1968, and 1982 Algerian war amnesties, which make French citizens immune for actions carried out during the war, could be stretched to include the events of the massacre, which may explain why. That, or all of those apologies, might not be as sincere as they sounded. Number 49, a genocide in the guise of philanthropy. At the turn of the 20th century, Belgium's King Leopold II privately owns the Congo Free State, a territory 80 times the size of Belgium, and he ran it as a personal money machine built on forced labor, brutality, and murder. Under his rule, Congolese villagers who failed rubber collection quotas had their hands chopped off, women were taken hostage to coerce men into slavery, and those who resisted were shot or their villages burned. It was colonial exploitation at its most depraved, and may have resulted in the deaths of upwards of 10 million people through killings, starvation, overwork, and disease exacerbated by Leopold's policies. And the great irony of it all, Leopold peddled himself as a humanitarian, if you could believe that shit, claiming he was bringing Christianity, commerce, and civilization to Central Africa, all the while he was looting ivory and rubber at gunpoint. People did speak out against it, but when missionaries and whistleblowers like Edmund Morel and Roger Casement began exposing the atrocities, Morel from 1900 and Casement from 1904, Leopold simply launched a PR counter-offensive, funding lobbyists and buying off newspapers to dispute truthful accounts as mere exaggerations or malicious slander by rivals and anti-patriotic traitors alike. But ultimately, the truth became too big to bury. The reports, testimonies, and photographic evidence piled up, and international condemnation began to boil over, particularly in Britain and the United States. Within Belgium, too, the tide started to turn as Parliament, the press, and even segments of the Catholic Church began demanding answers. All of that domestic pressure, coupled with the fact that the rubber bubble that had been earning him a fortune from his colony had popped, resulting in him giving up control of the colony in 1908. Not that he granted it independence, mind you, no. He simply gave the keys of the Congo to the Belgian government instead. Ultimately, it was a last-ditch effort to salvage his reputation and limit the damage. And accordingly, before the handover, Leopold ordered thousands of documents destroyed to cover up the full extent of his crimes. Not that improved anything for the poor Congolese particularly, as the Belgian government stacked up plenty of its own crimes that it has had to start confronting in recent years. In 2002, for example, the Belgian government formally apologized for its involvement in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba, the first Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, acknowledging a moral responsibility, even if not a legal one. And similarly, in 2024, the Brussels Court of Appeal ruled that the Belgian state committed a crime against humanity by removing mixed-race Congolese children from their black mothers, and 5 women were awarded €50,000 each in damages. As for Leopold himself, he didn't give a to be quite blunt, and he died in 1909 with his pockets full of plunder, having never expressed so much as even a word of regret for his actions. His great-great-grandnephew, King Philip, did express his deepest regrets in 2020, so I guess that's something. I mean, he didn't put his hands in his pockets or, do anything actually meaningful to right the historical wrongs that paid for that nice big palace that he gets to call home, but he was real sad about it. Maybe? Number 50. The Mullavikal Massacre. For our final entry, we head to Sri Lanka, where in May 2009, one of the most brazen cover-ups of modern times unfolded on a narrow strip of sand called the Mullavikal. There, the island nation's brutal 26-year civil war was reaching its bloody conclusion as the Sri Lankan army boxed in the last remnants of the Tamil Tigers alongside hundreds of thousands of Tamil civilians, and then proceeded to massacre them. Hospitals were shelled, tent shelters were bombed, crowds of fleeing civilians were machine-gunned. Entire so-called no-fire zones declared by the Sri Lankan government and endorsed by the UN became scenes of annihilation. Field and makeshift hospitals in Mullavikal, clearly marked and often with their GPS coordinates given to government forces, were repeatedly hit by artillery and aerial bombardment. In one instance, on May the 2nd alone, 68 people were killed and a further 87 were injured in the shelling of a Mullavikal hospital, despite the facility being well within a declared safe zone. Aid workers and survivors are recounted scenes of charred corpses, bodies buried in mass graves or left exposed to the sun, and survivors unable to tend to the wounded while under fire. Those fleeing areas under fire were shot in the open or executed after surrendering. Victims described mutilated children, mothers cradling lifeless infants, and paramilitary forces firing into crowds that included the elderly and infirm. When assessing all of that, horror, different methodologies, the ratio of surgical cases to fatalities, population counts from displaced camps, and aid agency records led the UN to estimate that civilian deaths alone are likely in the tens of thousands, possibly as low as 15 to 20,000, but with other credible estimates reaching 40,000 or more, including some that even suggest figures upwards of 75,000. And yet amid this horror, the Sri Lankan government at first maintained a suitably vague story, not saying that it hadn't killed civilians, civilians, but saying instead that it had followed a so-called zero civilian casualties strategy, i.e. that it had carried an equally large carrot and stick, showing no remorse to the Tamil Tigers, but not intending to target civilians. If from that you infer that they were saying that they killed no civilians, then that's on you, at least as far as they were concerned. That line, however, soon changed with the founding of the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, a body ostensibly charged with getting to the bottom of the whole damn mess that was the Sri Lankan Civil War from the point of the collapse of a 2002 ceasefire agreement. There was just too much evidence of what they had done for them not to change their line, even to a small degree. Eventually, the commission begrudgingly admitted that hospitals had been hit and civilians had died during the massacre, which they simply called the 2008-2009 Northern Offensive. However, it also branded those deaths as tragic and unavoidable, attributing blame to crossfire or mathematical error when plotting ballistic trajectories, never intent. The government had investigated itself and found itself innocent. Shocking. We know. The UN, for all it was worth, disagreed pretty severely, with the Secretary-General's panel of experts concluding in 2011 that there was credible evidence of crimes against humanity. In follow-up, it urged an independent international investigation, something Sri Lanka still refuses to allow. Ultimately, no generals have been prosecuted and no ministers have been held to answer. Instead, they got exactly what they wanted for the Tamil Tigers and the Tamils more broadly to be so decisively crushed that they wouldn't be a threat to Colombo for a long, long time to come. But Malavaikal remembers. The bones beneath the sand remember. And though Sri Lanka has buried its massacres with monuments and proclamations, the dead have a habit of rising, if not in body, then in memory. Thank you for watching.